welcome once again, Hearthstone friends. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our 5th weekly Classic Deck Spotlight. As always, I'm your host, Opposition. Our guest tonight is the most recent North American Tournament champion and first place finisher on the North American ladder last season. Welcome, Arcues. It's an honor to have you here.
Thanks.
So, before we get started, I usually like to ask a couple of personal questions, let the fans get to know you a little bit better. So my first question is, how long you played Hearthstone for?
Since its very release.
Oh, wow. Okay, so you actually played the classic format in Standard then, huh?
Yep.
Nice. Awesome. And what was your first deck back then? You remember?
I really don't remember. I definitely have a general idea. I remember playing Phase Hunter, and I remember being really bad at it. The main problem was, well, I really didn't go face enough. I traded way too much, and I mean, yeah, that definitely goes against deck's playstyle. Other than that, probably Zoo. There are some things I definitely remember, like wanting to play Handlock, wanting to play Freeze Mage, but not having the cards for it.
Yeah, Warrior was another one back then where it's like the game is just starting and you have to have the dust to buy like Rag and Grom and Alex. And
Yeah, it was always known as the most expensive decks, but Control Warrior was always probably one of my least favorite decks. Like, I always prefer decks that are more proactive rather than just reactive, hero power pass.
Right. Now, did you play Standard Wild? Have you played this whole time, or have you taken some breaks in there?
I've definitely taken a lot of breaks. Hearthstone was definitely my main game early on, especially basically up to like maybe 2015, slowed down in 2016, as it was also one of like the biggest games on Twitch. It definitely had a lot more of like a community and stuff, especially because Twitch is one of the main daily activities I do anyway. So having them be a lot more intertwined was great.
Yeah.
Obviously things are a lot more simple back then. I played a lot more Arena, I'd say. Watched a lot of Trump, watched a lot of Crip. 2015 started watching Forsen mainly, and yeah. I think my most successful part was probably in the Grand Tournament when playing Secret Paladin, if people remember that. I was able to get rank 4 Legend as that. Never really got as far since then. Other than that, when playing Wild, there was a time when Beast Druid was near top tier deck. Not too sure how top tier, but I got rank 2 Legend with that. And I remember that I streamed like one of my first streams was like over like 20 friends from high school all watching that Hearthstone stream, and unfortunately only got rank 2 Legend, but still quite good.
Yeah, still very impressive to be able to do that, especially in Standard and Wild where there's so many more players. Very, very impressive achievement there. So what got you interested in playing Classic again?
I always preferred, I mean, actually, I guess I can't really say always preferred this game mode. It's more that, like, because I took so many breaks from Hearthstone, there's, for one, a lot more cards to learn, but also the direction Hearthstone is going in terms of the decks is something I'm not personally as much a fan of, where it feels like there's too much control and combo-related stuff. So for one, you have to count for, like, way too many different cards, which is just a pain to bother thinking about, and also the lack of like the lack of board presence you're able to have, where a lot of times it feels like if you play anything on board, even if you get like an enormous board, it can easily be wiped out by a single card, and it just feels like, okay, your minions don't matter, and I really prefer when minions matter.
Yeah, or just, in making incremental progress on the board, solidifying
Pretty
the board,
much.
yeah, making sticky
Yeah,
minions.
that's the main way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, we just hosted a tournament this weekend. You took first place in that. And one of the things that we touched on in our winners interview was that now that you've kind of beaten the multiplayer Hearthstone campaign, what's next for you? You've gotten first place Legend. You've won the North American Championship this month. What's next for you?
Well, I can't say there's like much of like a next. I feel like, I mean, there's not much to progress towards. I mean, obviously the classic format is limited. I mean, if there were other tournaments, I'd like to enter them, but I would say for the most part. Oh right, actually another big reason I got back into Hearthstone was Honestly, from watching Yu-Gi-Oh, they kind of fed into each other, where it's like watching it made me want to play Hearthstone, like it really got me in the mood, and playing Hearthstone also meant, well, I have something to do, and while also having something to watch on the side screen. The other thing being it's a kind of thing where like you don't have to put as much effort into, so you can pay attention to like a TV show at the same time, which is great.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
but to really answer the question, I guess probably nothing's really next as much. Like just do more tournaments, hope to keep winning.
Yeah, there's a quote from the Chess World Championship contender, Yen Nepomniachtchi, that I've always liked, and maybe this is something that describes you as well. He says, in general, when they say, what's your biggest tournament success or something, I always try to say that I hope it is still ahead. So here's to hoping maybe EU Championship next, build up your collection over there, play against some of those
Um,
players.
Actually, that's a fair point, right? That's just straight up more money to earn if there's more tournaments to join. So
Sure.
yeah, I may consider that actually.
Cool. Well, I wish you luck if you do. All right,
Same.
so let's talk a little bit about this the deck that we've got in front of us here today. So
All right.
today we're going to be covering Tempo Mage. Now, for the viewers out there, this is a wildly popular deck in some early standard rotations with cards like Flamewaker and Mad Scientist, where it could really decisively swing the board. You play these combos with Sorcerer's Apprentice and Flamewaker and zero mana cards like Arcane Missiles and just be able to dump a ton of damage onto the board. Um, but in classic, Tempo Mage kind of lacks some of those tools, and it hasn't been a very popular deck on the ladder. But you've kind of single-handedly resurrected it here recently. I'm curious, what got you interested in this deck in the first place?
Well, I mean, surprising it may be, it's Tempo Mage from basically exactly what you explained got me into it. Like back in like Blackrock Mountain, for example, like Tempo Mage is like probably one of my funnest decks. It was like I love the idea of like you just get to snowball like as soon as possible. Like turn one Mana Wyrm, turn two Apprentice. Um, if like your opponent's playing stuff on board, you can even send some missiles out early. Then turn free Flamewaker, coin, just completely dump your hand, secure the game, if not just win it right there. It's the exact kind of deck I just love.
Yeah. Now, in Classic, it doesn't have quite the explosive tools that it used to have. What do you feel is Tempo Mage's role in the current ladder meta?
Um, I don't feel like it has as much as a specific role, and I think that's also why I kind of like it. Um, I'd say it reminds me a lot more of Yugi from Yu-Gi-Oh! 2 in the sense of a lot of the decks he versus are, they have specific themes, while his is just a lot more. It's a lot more versatile and ready for like any situation. And I think Tempo Mage serves a similar purpose where there isn't necessarily I think there's no like exact counter like bad matchup that really comes to mind, but it's not like particularly a hard counter in general either. I don't know what I could say its win percentages are. I probably would actually have to like still try more and like actually pay attention. I just think it's an overall decent deck.
So, as far as the ladder meta is concerned, there are a lot of polarized decks there, and in the tournament meta, we're talking about kind of a different format. Do you feel like it's got that same kind of flexibility there, or was there a more specific reason to play that in a tournament?
For one, it was just a deck that I was more confident in. I am not as confident in many other decks that I've tried. The main thing it does come down to was playing a more balanced deck, because ladder and tournament, I paid more attention to this and really try to figure out more of like what a lot of the big differences are. One is open deck lists is a big deal because then there's no surprises. Like you'll know, like if you bring a weapon deck, if someone's running like a Tech Ooze or something, for example, or like if someone's running secrets, you'll know exactly what secrets they have. So no surprises there. Um,
Which is interesting because your deck has both of those things. It has a Tech Ooze in it, and it also has three secrets that it plays. So you lose
yeah.
some of the surprise value in a tournament, and yet you were still successful with it.
Well, that's admittedly why I did change it. These aren't as much supposed to come as surprises. Like earlier on, I had two Oozes because I was, more people bought my aggro, but then they turned it down, and I realized, well, into other matchups, it's just too weak against. I figured one should be decent enough. And the other thing is just the reason Ooze is good in general, I feel like, is with a lot of your 2-drops, almost all of them can be played later in the game. Sorcerer's Apprentice, you can combo with a bunch of spells. Knife Juggler, you can play with like mirror images, and if Juggler lives, you could just get more and more value out of it. None of these you're in a rush to play. And Ooze, depending on the matchup. So if you're versing something like Zoo, you're completely happy to just play it on turn 2. And
Right.
so figured it's really not that much of a problem card. As much as well as the free drops, the secrets are never really a surprise in the first place. Like I would say on ladder, you can try use that to your advantage and like run I don't remember what it's called. I think Spellbinder, the epic spell that
Yeah. Yep.
makes it target a 1/3 instead.
Yeah.
That one you can definitely consider more specifically for ladder. The other thing too is there is still a surprise element where the difference between playing around Mirror Entity versus Counterspell, it's massive. Like consider like something like Handlock, for example, where turn 4 is when they play a card which is generally going to be the deciding factor for whether they win or lose the game. They can attempt to play Hellfire, possibly clear the board, or they can try play a Giant/Drake to get a big minion and then hopefully taunt it up next turn.
Right.
So
And that's
the secrets, they're
Neat.
insanely impactful there. No other card can really compete like that.
Yeah. Free 8/8 on our opponent's turn seems like a pretty good thing. Basically, an 8/8 charge.
Yep.
And like you say, when you're playing against decks that have more expensive spells and more expensive minions, traditionally Druid has been one of those decks as well. Although they have Wrath and stuff. But yeah, it can be absolutely backbreaking when you just don't know, right? There's a 50% chance essentially for your opponent to just straight lose the game in those situations.
Yeah. I did notice that you, because I did watch the tournament VOD, I noticed you brought up quite a bit that if the deck was to counter Druid, I never had any particular counter in mind, and I would think even without the secrets into Druid, it's still decent. Like the way I see it is like for one, you get the board first, and if they can't instantly counter the board, then you can easily snowball ahead. Like any minions they play, you can just trade off. Like they wild growth into like eventually a Yeti or a Druid of the Claw. You can just fireball it, and if you have like a Mana Wyrm or even a 2-drop on the board, you're just getting more and more damage to their face. And there's quite a few Druids that don't even run Taunt, so by the time they may play something like Ancient Allure or Rag, it's just too late, and they don't have the time to be able to get the value from those cards anyway. So, you don't really need much more help against Ramp Druid, I feel.
Yeah, there are a lot of. There are a lot of things in this deck that line up pretty well with Druid in general, but some other decks as well. What do you say? You want to build this deck? Show everybody what this is about.
Sure.
All right. So we're starting off
So,
0 cards. What do you think is the most core part of this deck that we want to add?
probably Mana Worms, and I think Fireball. I mean, Mana Worm obviously just straight up being one of, if not the best 1-drop in the game, and Fireball, it's like, I mean, just consider how many decks use Leroy and literally just use it as a Fireball, if not an even worse Fireball, for when they trade it into a minion.
Yep,
Or,
absolutely.
can't go past Taunt. And also compared to cards like Kill Command.
Right,
Yeah,
does a little bit more damage, a little bit more reach.
it's
Also,
insane.
it also evenly trades off with cards like Druid of the Claw, which are traditionally cards that, kind of problematic to remove. You think like Lava Burst 5 damage, Kill Command 5 damage, but being able to do 6 damage to some things can be really powerful at the 4 slot.
Yeah, on top of obviously just doesn't have the downside, and even better than that, it already synergizes with, Mana Worm, just spell damage and Apprentice. Like, if you just compare it, it's just insane.
Yeah. So real high value cards already. Mana Worm, Fireball, 2 class cards. What do you think is next? What else goes in here?
Um, I guess other key cards I would think of, Water Elemental, just extremely solid 4-drop, and then Arcane Missiles being very, very efficient, potentially at least, removal. Like its potential against aggro is insane. Like there were times I've considered Arcane Explosion, but in so many of the cases I wanted it, I realized it would do nearly the exact same thing as Arcane Missiles anyway.
Yeah, unless you roll really badly on the missiles, the larger their board gets, the greater the chance you have of clearing things like, in a good fashion. And how often are you really in a position where you need to clear more than four minions with one health, right? As that you
Ideally, you shouldn't be in that position in the first place.
Right, exactly. So Arcane Missiles seems to usually deal with the board pretty well. It may miss one of the minions, but you still got a good, 50% chance to clean up, right?
Yeah. I'd say if there's any cards I could have like more than two of, first would probably be Fireball, and I think second Arcane Missiles.
Maybe they'll release a new legendary that they'll put in Classic where you can do that. Um, so there's also some synergy here at the beginning as well, right? Because we can play Mana Wyrm and we can back it up with Arcane Missiles. Decks like Zoo are going to have trouble clearing the Mana Wyrm. They just don't have the turn one play most of the time, and especially if you're playing first, there's no way to contest Mana Wyrm for some decks. So you follow up with Arcane Missiles, kill anything that could trade with it, and all of a sudden now your Mana Wyrm, in addition to being a 3 health priority threat on the board, is gaining attack while we do that as well.
Yeah, you do have a few times where you can just steal the game on the first or second turn against Zoo with like, let's say they play Flame Imp, you can Mana Wyrm Coin Missiles and, either win the 50-50 to either straight up just win or lose the game. It's like, whether or not that on its own is good, it's like knowing you at least have that option to like make the game a near 50-50. Like, and that's at worst. Like, if you have better options depending on what's in your hand, like you can always take those too. So
Yeah, very powerful card. How does this fare against other classes? Obviously, against Paladin and Zoo, it's probably going to do pretty well. For maybe some of the decks like Warrior, Shaman, do you feel like Arcane Missiles is just not quite enough, that it can be a dead card, or is it still useful?
against warriors, definitely not as useful. There are times I think you can consider just sending it face if, let's say, you have like a mana worm on board to buff it. Other than that, I do expect to be holding on to it and just the value from it. I think is definitely really, really, really low into that. Shaman, I mean, they definitely have a lot more minions. There's definitely more value you can gain from it. Um, and you can definitely use it to clear more board than just using missiles alone. Like something I've done a lot, and including against Miracle Rogue 2 to kill Auctioneer without Flame Strike, is being able to play a Juggler, play Arcane Missiles, while also then having like a mirror image, and maybe you already have spell damage, and basically you get a lot of missiles at that point.
Yeah, the speaking of Juggler, this is a card that I think is a really interesting inclusion. We've heard a lot of people that have been trying to make this Tempo Mage deck work for months in the Discord server, saying that they just don't feel like Knife Juggler has a place. Now, in the tournament over the weekend, I noticed that you were very conservative about when you played your Juggler and when you played this other card that it combos with here, the Mirror Image. Tell us
Yep.
a little bit about how do we use the Juggler in this deck?
Um, I would say depending on what you verse, I really, really am hesitant to just play it on turn two to let it die. So the first thing I would say is, how likely do you think it is to die, and what is it going to trade into? There are times you will just have to play it. The main thing that I would consider is the potential of it can be very high, but a lot of times in the worst case scenarios, the floor isn't that low while the ceiling is really high. Depending on your matchup, I would say into more aggressive things. If let's say you're versing a class that maybe they have a 2-1, and maybe they have like, I mean, I guess in that case you'd pick. If let's say they have a flame in, depending on how much you need to contest the board right away versus you can play for future turns. If I have mirror images in hand, I'm thinking, okay, just ping stuff down, get everything low, then have a big swing turn with Knife Juggler and Mirror Image. And basically, I would use it a lot more like you do the Hounds combo in Face Hunter. And this is another thing that I've learned, which back then I didn't really know as well. But with Face Hunter, especially into like decks like Zoo, it's really hard to contest the board 1-for-1. You need to play for value. You need to get like max value out of like your explosive trap into, destroying most of their minions or maybe leaving a few here and there at like 1 health, into then Juggler Unleash to then clear the board and then get the board back. Because if you don't do that, you basically are not going to be able to contest the Zoolock at all. And sometimes it will be like that for Mage, where you basically have to do the same thing, where you need to just Juggler later in the game, play images with it, and then maintain the board. Maybe you don't even necessarily kill the board. The images can soak up some stuff, but you still have that Juggler. You can still get knives out later, and you can still then swing the board back in your favor.
Yeah, I would say this is sort of a common thread with some of these more sophisticated decks, especially those that run Juggler, is that as you pointed out with Face Hunter, oftentimes on turn 4 you want to be playing Trap Hero Power, turn 5 you want to play Juggler Unleash to kill anything that they reloaded with, and similarly here with Knife Juggler Mirror Image, I would say Rogue is another one, Miracle Rogue is another one that has to sometimes make those decisions. If your hand is, SI, Thalnos, Backstab, Prep Fan, well, you could burn all of them in one turn. You could wait for your opponent to commit a little bit more to the board. You could commit, halfway with Coin SI. A lot of different ways to go about it. But a lot of chances to go wrong as well, right? Because if we misjudge a little bit, then we end up with a Knife Juggler that's just shooting into Doom Guards and Dark Iron Dwarfs as well. So probably a lot of judgment that goes into that. But
yeah, there are definitely a lot of cases where you're just not gonna get enough value out of it, and that can be okay. Like, if you just compare this to like any other card you can really try and replace it with, like, there's not that many cards that would be able to help you enough in that situation. And like, when you think of the very unique situations, if it's, let's say, against Zoo and they have a full board, that's when it's something like Arcane Explosion. But again, we talked about this, where a lot of the times you prefer missiles anyway. You have 2 of them. Like, it's not something you can easily substitute.
Right. Yeah, I think that explanation makes a lot of sense. And I think sometimes maybe the frustration that players have by putting Juggler in this deck is that they're playing it too early, not using it to its full potential, maybe not weaving in hero powers as much as they could be. Another famous card. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I would say definitely consider how much potential your Juggler has. Also going into whatever matchup you're versing. Like, I would say against like a warrior, for example, sometimes if you just don't have anything else to play, you'd have to play it. But at the same time, it's why I run Ooze, because it's like, their most efficient thing is War Axe, so Ooze allows you to not fall too far behind.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, and admittedly, the Juggler can be very difficult to deploy against a warrior, where if they have an Armor Smith or an Acolyte on the board, you actually don't really want to play the Knife Juggler. So a lot of times it can be okay to let it die on turn 2, as some decks, like Mid-Range Hunter, is okay just soaking up a charge of the warrior's War Axe, because Juggler's not going to get much damage done anyway.
Yeah, I would say a lot of this can just come down more so to the mulligan, since we're talking about basically turn 2. I would definitely play a lot more probably for Mana Wyrm, and if you can, you definitely want to try and get it with images. Otherwise, if you just play a 2-mana minion on turn 2 against a warrior, you are really, really expecting it to die. But then again, your other option is, what good is it going to do later? Because if you hold on too long for Juggler, odds are they're going to have Acolyte down, they're going to have Armor Smith down. Like, those juggles are going to lose more and more value, and sometimes you need to just cut your losses.
Yeah, absolutely. But extremely powerful against creature-based decks, especially those that flood the board with a bunch of 1-health minions and have good reload.
Yep.
Okay, so we talked a little bit about Sorcerer's Apprentice already as well. Now, she seems like a pretty natural inclusion, another class card. Tell us a little bit about how do you use this card? Is this one of those cards like you want to curve out like you would with Flame Waker, or in Classic, are we a little bit more careful with how we play this?
I would say there's not as much you need to be careful with, but at the same time, as you mentioned, Tempo Mage not being as good, you can't really curve out as well as you could with something like Flame Waker. Like, you don't have as many cheap spells you can play with it. The idea generally is it is just one of your most solid 2-drops. You can get the most value out of it. And obviously that means there will be times that you don't get insane amount of value. Like that goes for everything. Like that's the main thing I would say people always need to consider is like you can't always guarantee huge value out of every single card all the time. But like a card like this on its own will more often than not almost always like get its value. Like and at worst it's a 2 mana free 2, which a lot of the times is quite fine.
Right. And I think, other than Innervate and Preparation, this may be the only other mana cheat card in Classic. I don't know, maybe there's another one that I'm missing, but that's something that I think we don't touch on too much when we're talking about Mage or we're talking about this deck, is that mana cheating decks tend to be more powerful, the two S tier decks are Druid and Rogue. But this kind of allows us to do it as well. It's not necessarily going to give us as much value immediately as something like Preparation will, which is reducing by 3 right now. But if we get a Sorcerer's Apprentice to stick to the board, it does have the power to be as good as Prep or as Innervate if we just get it to stay alive.
I mean, it can definitely make a noticeable difference. Like the difference of spending 1 mana can definitely change the game. I guess if I think of more common examples, it could be like for one big common one I would say that I would like, especially against stuff like Zoo, would be something like Knife Juggler, Apprentice, spend all your mirror images / Arcane Missiles, and then you now have the board and win the game. Obviously, it's a very specific hand, but this also doesn't even need to happen on turn 4. This can happen later as well.
Mm-hmm.
And against other decks, you can even something very simple like Apprentice into Arcane Intellect. You can then potentially draw other cards that you're able to then curve out well with as well.
Right, right. Like if we get a 2 mana Arcane Intellect, there's a chance that we also get a Mirror Image or an Arcane Missiles off of that, which would then be free. So it does kind of allow us to snowball sometimes, especially, yeah, with this little synergy that it has with Arcane Intellect. I didn't really think about that before.
Yeah, just on its own, it's obviously not as good as it could be in other expansions, but I mean, that's for the most part Classic in general. Cards are a lot more limited, and the cards that are a lot more abusable, like stuff like Auctioneer, you know, they're a lot more few, I'd say.
Yeah, yeah. Now I'm just going to throw Frostbolt in there. I think this one's a pretty self-explanatory pick. It's a freeze, or it's a freeze. It's a burn spell. It's 2 mana. One thing that sometimes I think gets sort of lost in this discussion of cost reduction is looking at the percentage reduction in these spells, because yeah, it doesn't sound that great. Your spells cost 1 less, but that means Frostbolt costs half as much, right? And what are you want to say, infinitely less for Arcane Missiles or Mirror Image. But a free spell
That's a big deal.
Yeah, it's not supposed to be free, or cutting down the cost of these relatively low cost spells like Frostbolt or Arcane Intellect. A 50 or 33% in reduction in cost is a lot. It allows us to play a lot of other stuff on that turn.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
it gives you a lot of options. Like, I would say, I mean, obviously, if you want to get the reduction early, then best you can do is probably like turn free, coin it. But if it's something like Zoo and they have other stuff, then well, you may need to play a mirror image along with it. But if you're able to do that, you're in a super good spot. Even later in the game, being able to play like Apprentice plus like again Arcane Intellect, and then you can honestly just Frostbolt just to freeze a minion, and that can cause so much pressure against something like a Druid, where he may have to trade really inefficiently, or he just has to let it live. And at that point, if he has to let it live, he plays a minion. You can fireball it. You can potentially, I mean, maybe go for game, but this is another reason. Like I like the idea of secrets. Is even if you don't get it specifically with Kirin Tor, you still always have that spell synergy where synergizes with your Mana Wyrm, synergizes with your Apprentice. So the chance of it being bad is it's a lot lower. You have a lot of more tools to make it quite decent, and that's why I like the spell combo as the taking up the free mana slot.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about these secrets. We've got 1 copy of Counterspell and 2 copies of Mirror Entity. So tell us about Mirror Entity a little bit first.
Mirror Entity, you could almost always expect to at least do bare minimum. Some decks, it will just steal the game, like Handlock, for example, you can put them in what would have previously been a fine situation. You know, they're just simply Hellfire or Twilight Drake and Taunt. They're fine, and the secret alone just completely destroys the Handlock. Like I think if you're a Handlock going to 10-4, a secret's one of probably the scariest things you can see
Yeah.
versing a mage.
Yeah.
Other than that, the biggest downside is probably quite obviously is when versing Doomsayer. The decks that run that are definitely quite few though, and I would say if you are versing something like a Freeze Mage, you really have to be careful. And honestly, I would say you can probably never even play it because you know if they're not getting Doomsayer, maybe they just give you like a Novice Engineer and ping it anyway.
Right.
I would say if you're versing Freeze Mage, you may just not play it, or maybe even just save it for like turn 8 or 9 and just maybe try to steal Alex at least or something.
Yeah.
Or scare them with a threat of potential counterspell.
It makes me kind of happy that I play Doomsayer in my handlock. Uh, now I'm realizing just how powerful that can be. So against Freeze Mage, and I don't think there are too many other decks that really play Doomsayer a lot. We know Malagos Druid
Yeah,
can
definitely not.
play play that as well. Um, but how often? I guess are they always? I guess they're always keeping Doomsayer against, if they know it's Tempo
No
Mage.
sings, yeah. But
Uh,
yeah, that is another big point you mentioned though, is if Temper Mage was to get more popular, the inclusion of Doomsayer into Handlock would be just absolutely massive for them.
yeah. What about the now? Now Counterspell is another one here that can be a complete dud if someone has like a 0 mana spell or something in their hand, but it can also be pretty backbreaking. Tell us a little bit about Counterspell.
So a lot of the times it's definitely harder to get value out of than Mirror Entity, as there's obviously a lot more means to get played and a lot more useless, I guess, spells that can be played into it. Or not necessarily useless, but sometimes you really want to specifically counter something, but if they've just been holding onto the coin and then they just throw that out. There are cases where you can potentially bait people with this. Like maybe someone well, not necessarily like counterspell itself, but like secrets in general. Where people will try play around both. And because they're playing around both, a lot of the times their turn will not be played optimally because they are scared of which secret it could be. So there may be a time where even if you don't get a you don't counter like that good of a spell, maybe you make it so they may play a very small minion to test for Mirror Entity first, and then they don't have enough mana to play the big minion they would have otherwise played. And
Right.
so just the fact of it being a secret alone is already a big deal. Um, the main other reason is just you simply do need an extra secret to put in, and obviously the scare factor is insane. The main reason I put in one is you're not always going to get as much value, and especially into certain decks like Zoo that only run 2 spells, it's going to be a near dead card in that. And as you mentioned before, there are a lot of like cheap spells like Hunter's Mark, Prep from Rogue, Innovate, or even just simply Coin. A lot of like 0 mana cards they can use to just soak it up with.
Yeah. The addition of just one counterspell makes a lot of sense, and I like what you're saying there too. Is um, the having two mirror entities and a counterspell is so much more powerful than just having, for example, two mirror entities, because it leaves your opponent guessing. And one of the things that we've talked about in past weeks has been this chess concept of the threat is stronger than the execution. Just the mere fact that you have a secret up means that your opponent is going to have a difficult time discerning what it is. And like you say, they may make a really suboptimal play as a result because they're trying not to trigger the mirror entity with their big minion, so they play a small minion, and it turns out to be counterspell. Now you dump everything on the board, and they have no spells that they can use to deal with it. So there are times at which just the mere fact that this is a secret is backbreaking for the opponent. We also have the Kirin Tor Mage in here as well. Now, I've actually seen a couple people cut this from Tempo Mage lists. Do you feel like this is a card that's absolutely essential to the deck, or is this a card that maybe we could lose?
I think if there's any cards you could lose, it's probably the secret package. But obviously, if you add it, then you need pretty much, I'd say, nearly all five, if not maybe like four. Maybe you could cut Counterspell. Um, I would say the main concern was I tried initially without it because, well, I tried with it a little bit earlier on. Obviously it didn't really work out, so wasn't that big of a fan. So I felt like I wanted something that seemed more consistent. Um, Tried stuff like Harvest Golem, and I would say try just simply putting in one drops. A lot of it didn't really do what I hoped it would. Like I would hope something like Harvest Golem could, just simply get something on board because your two drops could die easily, and also just decent thing to play on free and something to contest aggro. But it was, I would argue, it's kind of like a jack of all trades, master of none kind of card. It didn't do what I would hope it would do well enough. Um, Other options being one drops are, similar thing. They can be decent against aggro, but then into other things, not so good. Kirin Tor can definitely be more of a hit or miss card, but the potential for it is a lot higher. And I think the main thing that I was concerned about was the downside, was how bad it can be. It can be a free mana for free, and obviously when people just think of it like that, they're not going to want to run it. But if you do pull the combo off, like, that is a really, really big deal. As I mentioned before, against a handlock, you completely steal the game. A Harvest Golem won't steal you the game. A one drop won't steal you the game. And this also can go for a lot of other matchups too, like potentially even like Ramp Druid, Control Warrior, even Zoo can be quite good against. While it's like, yeah, you don't want to be too greedy. The When you really consider its overall value, I think it might be ideal. I am not fully certain, I'll say, but this is definitely my line of thinking with it, and I definitely like it a fair bit.
Well, one of the things I would think, we've talked about handlock, and it sounds like it just beats the shit out of handlock. But if you're playing against a handlock, for example, and you're able to drop Mana Wyrm, you're maybe able to drop whatever else early on in the game. Being able to play Kirin Tor on turn 3 and put a counterspell into play means that the perfect Hellfire target board of like Mana Wyrm Mirror Image, or Mana Wyrm Knife Juggler Kirin Tor can't be cleared by spells, and there's just no way to deal with it otherwise. And they might end up playing around Mirror Entity if they've got a Drake that turn and a Hellfire that turn. They just try and play Hellfire and they get punished for it. So immense value going into that turn 4, and same with Druid, right? There are plenty of 5 mana minions or 6 mana minions they could innervate out, and being able to play a 4/3 with tempo and discount 3 mana cost secret, you might be getting yourself a free Karen or Sylvanas, right? With an innervate.
Yeah, and I guess a little more about the tournament, since there was a lot more shamans, I'd say. Even something like that. A lot of them don't really run many one drops, and the ones that they do run are probably already going to be played. And also kind of goes for the spells, right? Like if you already have a Juggler, Apprentice, or Mana Wyrm out, they probably would have already attempted to kill it by then. So it's like on that turn you play the Kirin Tor. Odds are they were looking to either Lightning Storm, maybe Feral Spirit, or maybe even like play Sen'jin. Maybe a lower value you can maybe get some like Argus or Flame Tongue, but generally like against like Shaman, I would say odds are you're gonna get something pretty decent.
Yeah, being able to especially counter Lightning Storm. I think we might have seen a situation in the tournament in which Lightning Storm was a threat. But yeah, Counterspell and Kirin Tor, that's their only removal, right? For a wide board is to play Lightning Storm. They don't have, and like you said, they probably would have played the Lightning Bolt or the Rock Biter at this point in the game anyway by turn 3. So being able to pull out that Counterspell and think, well, it's probably going to get something 3 or greater, which is huge value for it. Yeah. Okay, we got a couple other cards in here that are some cycling as well. So first we've got Thalnos, and we've got 2 copies of Loot Hoarder. I've seen a couple people that are running one copy of Loot Hoarder, one copy of Thalnos in certain decks, just to leave it at 2 cards that cycle. What's your reasoning behind having the 2 Loot Hoarders and the Bloodmage together?
For one, I felt like it because I didn't want to see it as much of like an aggro deck because it can play for late game. I feel like the cycle is quite good, and overall, I would say it's one of the most it's a very consistent minion. It's something you're almost never unhappy to play. Like you get it on turn 2, you're not unhappy to play this turn 2. You get it later in the game, you're not unhappy to get it later in the game because you potentially cycle. And at best case, you play it on turn 2, you potentially trade into like a flame imp. Um, this is like when comparing it to stuff like the Juggler, where people may be scared to play it on turn 2, and you think of, okay, what are the main options you can get for turn 2? I know some people like to run Fairy Dragon, but I think it's too susceptible to something like a War Axe still, or weapons in general, or even like, like a Innovated Keeper, or if you're versing Zoo, maybe they still just have minions they can trade into it.
Right.
Loot Hoarder can generally have stuff to trade into. The main issue with Loot Hoarder would be if, let's say, your opponent has like a 1/1 on the board, and that's what your hero power is for. You can make it so if there is something bad for Loot Hoarder to trade into, you would just ping that target anyway. So odds are Loot Hoarder is always going to get a solid amount of value. So a very, very reliable card. Just one of the better 2-drops. There's not many like cards that you can consistently play on turn 2 and just feel fine with. And again, it's a card that can be played almost any time of the game and you can be fine with.
Yeah, there's something I think we talked about a few weeks ago on the show where we were discussing this concept of proactive and reactive 2-drops, or I suppose instead of reactive, you could almost say combo-y 2-drops. So Sorcerer's Apprentice is not usually something you want to play raw on the board on turn 2, unless you have something to combo, like you're going to play Arcane Missiles, Mirror Image, something like that. And same with Juggler, as we were discussing. It's not too common that you would want to play this card just raw on the board on turn 2. You know that it's probably going to get removed. So we need something to play on that turn, right? We need something. So Loot Hoarder really fills that, where you don't feel like you're ever losing a card from doing it. If someone trades a minion into it, well, it may be a lower value minion, but at least Loot Hoarder replaces itself in your hand and draws you toward the tools that you need in order to win.
Pretty much. Like any card that if you're ever in a situation that you wouldn't want to play Juggler or you wouldn't want to be play Apprentice, that's what Loot Hoarder is for. Like, there are times you can absolutely play Juggler or Apprentice on 2. Like, a free mana free 2 it's still alright. Obviously, can get better, can get worse. But, like, and yeah, obviously, because they can get better, it does just, give Loot Hoarder the spotlight for the turn 2.
Now, if you didn't hold Loot Hoarder in your opening hand, and I don't know, you're facing any deck, do you feel like Thalnos is something that's worth playing onto the board just raw, or is this a card that you're looking to get a lot of value out of with Frostbolt, Arcane Missiles, maybe a swing turn with Sorcerer's Apprentice?
I'd say it really depends on what I'm versing, but overall, I think this goes with the rest of the deck, where the main idea is just be versatile. You don't need to be too greedy. Like, obviously, you can't expect to always be in the greatest of positions, but you can always be in a good enough one. I would say against something like Zoo, you probably need to hold it for either comboing with a Frostbolt maybe on like a Dark Iron, or a buffed up minion from like Young Priestess or something. Or you just combo it with like Arcane Missiles generally, I would think is a good one. Like you can go 10 2 ping, 10 free ping into Thalnos Missiles. Hang on a sec, I got that wrong, I forgot, no Apprentice. Yeah, you can just do ping into like Thalnos Missiles, and then the remaining Thalnos can potentially clear up whatever is left. On turn 2, I would say it really just depends on, are you looking to clear what they have, or are they playing like a slower match where they're not playing many minions right away? Like it's something like a Miracle Rogue, for example, I would say just go for the cycle. That's the main thing to consider, is the spell damage going to be worth it enough, which I would say in a lot more aggro matchups it would be, versus do you just want the cycle?
Yeah, absolutely. And there are some priority targets as well. If you're going into turn 5 on a rogue's turn, you know that they're probably going to play Azure Drake, right? So you can hold Thalnos and Frostbolt. You don't have to play them out on turn 3. You can wait for them, or on turn 4 you can wait for them to do that. So just kind of knowing your opponent's decks, knowing what they're capable of, what they're probably going to play,
Yep.
yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
Yep.
There's one other thing I wanted to mention here about Loot Hoarder and Thalnos. Now, this is a problem that some aggro decks have that play this card, is that if I'm top decking at the end of the game as aggro paladin, if I top deck Loot Hoarder, it means I can play Loot Hoarder on the board, but it either may get silenced or ignored that turn. So I don't always get the value out of it. And even if my opponent doesn't kill it and ignores it, well, I can send it face for 2 damage, but I also might really want that death rattle out of it. So one of the neat things about Mage is that it actually is a threat, right? Is because you can play Loot Hoarder and you can ping it off, or you can hit face with it if they ignore it and then ping it off. So you're able to get the damage out of it, you're able to get the draw out of it, and even though it costs 4 mana to cycle, if you're at the end of the game with no cards, Loot Hoarder, or you need a specific answer, Loot Hoarder can really help out there with the Mage hero power.
I don't think I've ever actually even been in this situation, to be honest, like at all. I think that level of desperation is really insane. The other thing is, when you look at the deck, it doesn't have a lot of high cost cards. So very often, if you do ping off the Loot Hoarder, the potential things that you get from it are often not going to be much better, or maybe just something you can't play. Like maybe if you end up getting something like Arcane Missiles, Mirror Image, or Frostbolt, or Secrets. There's a lot of times you can get stuff that aren't all that useful, and you would often really just prefer having that small minion that's able to keep swinging anyway. And obviously if it doesn't, then it's going to die later. Yeah. And the other thing being, whatever card you draw into, if you end up having your Loot Hoarder die next turn, and then whatever you draw, you can probably play those cards in the same turn if you need to anyway. But it's so niche. I think the only thing I could really think of maybe is if you're versing a deck where you're afraid, maybe Freeze Mage, and you're thinking they could play Ice Block or Alex next turn. And it's like, if you are not able to kill them right now, then it's going to be near impossible later.
Right.
I think that's the main situation you would find yourself in, which is extremely specific, and I think just extremely unlikely. Again, as I said, I've never been in this situation, but hey, if you find yourself in it, then maybe screenshot and post it in Discord or something.
Yeah, I was thinking, a situation where maybe Druid's holding combo and you're dead next turn. So you play Loot Hoarder,
it rarely
off,
gets
and
to
then,
that point.
Yeah, maybe you get Frostbolt, Fireball, or something. But yeah, I would assume you're snowballing the board hopefully before that.
I would say, yeah, you are expected to have the board, and if somehow they're able to just straight up kill you, you probably don't have the board. And a lot of the times, they're going to be in a position where they are more likely to need to just trade Force of Nature just to clear your board.
Right. Or play Force of Nature into Counterspell, more likely. Or hopefully.
That is not as likely, I'd say, but it is a threat for sure.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to this Azure Drake. You've got 2 copies in here. Some of the decks, like Miracle Rogue, have mostly cut their second copy of Azure Drake. You're running 2 here. Tell us a little bit about Azure Drake.
Well, for one, the difference in styles of deck is an insanely big part of it. The Auctioneer generally would like to be able to play Auctioneer, Coin, Conceal, and from that point, play spells to hopefully win the game, and there's chances that the Azure Drake could never get played. Other chance could be they play Azure Drake on 5 into, for one, getting a decent amount of value, potentially backstab, just simply get a minion out, and also cycle into Auction or Conceal. But there are times I feel like if you have the option between Auctioneer, Conceal on 6 versus 5, you really want to get it down sooner rather than later. You're going to get enough value from that Auctioneer anyway, and leaving it out an extra turn is quite dangerous. You potentially die. And Tempo Mage is not concerned with any of that whatsoever, because you are not doing massive value combos turn 6, 7, 8 to finish the game. You are just having a decent amount of value, and that's exactly what this is. Like, Azure Drake was like a standout card. I think it was ranked as like one of the top picks in Arena because of just the raw value it gives. Like, it's basically a power creep when you compare it to not novice engineer, gnomish engineer, right? The idea obviously costs 1 more mana, has 2 more stats, but then you just slap on spell damage, like completely for free. You just get spell damage.
Right.
That's a big deal. Like, there's not many solid 5-drops you'd really care for. If there were others, I would think maybe Strangleform Tiger is like a decent one. You could potentially finish off with Fireball next turn. But everything about it is just good. Decent enough 5-drop. Spell damage is good. Draw is good. It just raw value is good.
Yeah, I mean, one of the issues that I see a lot of people complaining about with this deck is I run out of cards too quickly. They say, and I can understand that because you're playing things like Sorcerer's Apprentice and Kirin Tor that dramatically discount the cost of your spells and will empty your hand quickly. There is a decent amount of cycle in your version. You've got Thalnos, you've got 2 Loot Hoarders, you've got 2 Arcane Intellects, and now you've got 2 Azure Drakes as well. So a pretty good amount of card draw. And it seems like if you're playing a slightly more value-oriented game, focused a little bit less on just killing them quickly like you would with a Flame Waker version of this, Azure Drake can be really good. And another thing is we have so many priority threats early on in the game, like the Knife Juggler, Sorcerer's Apprentice. It's probable that our opponents will have used some of their premium removal by that time. So when we get to turn 5, if we play it on turn 5 playing Azure Drake, the 4 health might actually be an issue for somebody that's trying to kill this. So when we're and Water Elemental, I suppose I should say in there too, because it's a 6 health minion. This is going to draw out a lot of removal, like Execute or something that would be naturally good against Azure Drake.
Yeah, Azure Drake also, I think, when I think of it a lot of the times, it could be near ending the game, where it's like, if you already have the board, your opponent's working on finally trying to stabilize, you Azure Drake, and by next turn, you might just have Fireball Frostbolt. Maybe they clear your other minions, but then you have Azure Drake, and on top of that, you have, what is that, like 15 damage from Fireball Frostbolt on turn 6. Like,
Right.
And this is again what I mean of like just an easy example of where the spell damage plus draw can just be so massive. But even if that's not enough, it's like you can always, like, as long as it's alive on its own, which normally it can be, because again you have so many priority threats that sometimes your opponent won't efficiently trade into you because they're like, oh, I have to deal with this Juggler, I have to deal with this Apprentice, and so it's like if you're then able to get the Azure Drake to stick, it's like another thing that on its own may not seem as threatening, but it's like, if your opponent doesn't deal with it, they're playing minions, and that's when that spell damage can really shine, especially when you have like then 6 mana. You'll end up having a lot more options with that much mana.
Yeah, absolutely. And with relatively cheap spells, I mean, we have Fireball, which is not the cheapest spell, but like we were talking about earlier, the ability to play Frostbolt for 1 mana rather than 2, if we're able to drop an Apprentice on that turn, or if we're able to drop Thalnos, we're just getting massive value out of it. So one of those threats that if it survives, we'll likely be able to make use of it, and probably make use of the spell damage card or the spell card that we draw from it as well.
Yep.
Last inclusion here, our big man Ragnaros. Now this is by far the most expensive minion in the deck. What made you choose Ragnaros?
I feel like if it's mostly self-explanatory, kind of. Overall, I would say the main thing I think about when Ragnaros is best, I would say, is when it can be used as a finisher. Probably one of the worst times to play it is, well, for one, obviously, if you're going to die by playing it, but for 2 being that maybe it just hits face, and hitting face is not good enough, or it hits a minion and maybe that's not good enough, and then they're just going to BGH it.
Yeah.
Especially in a deck like this that, for one, already plays so much for value, it's again a card that can be versatile. If it hits face, you potentially finish them off next turn with fireballs. If it hits a minion, then, well, you no longer have to run Polymorph in your deck, on top of obviously just getting a minion on the board. The main theme of this deck overall is just value. Like, each card, like, when combined with potentially other cards, their threats are absolutely massive, and they have to be dealt with. Now, a lot of the times you won't always get these combos, but with some cards, you will get combos with them. Like Mirror Image, like with Juggler, you can get a combo with Mana Wyrm, with even just Apprentice to at least keep it alive and then enable you to snowball later, or even having to play it with an Azure Drake if you're nearing the end of the game, keeping that single minion alive could be enough to help you finish off your opponent. And you did mention that there is a lack of draw, and instead of like opting for more draw, since it pretty much has all it can get without doing something a little more inefficient, then Ragnaros is, I guess I would say, your ace monster. It's your biggest threat, and when I considered the other potential big threats, which would be something like Archmage, maybe even Can, because it's just a sticky minion that you can play earlier on, and I would like to think that it can get a bit of damage in there due to just simply how sticky it is, and because by this point in the game, due to the nature of your deck, you'd expect you've controlled the board a bit, you've done a bit of damage, you can really just simply push for value. And overall, I think Ragnaros does that best.
Is there any consideration for a card like Sylvanas in here? It seems like your main reasoning for Kirin and for Ragnaros is potential to do damage, but also potential to just clear a minion, whatever you need in that moment. What do you think about having Sylvanas in there?
I thought about Sylvanas a bit. I think it's a bit risky just because the low point of Sylvanas is often a lot lower, and I would say doesn't fit with what you want to do in this deck. Like, this deck plays more so for value, I would say, and this can generally mean you kill a lot of your opponent's minions, and you try to preserve yours. But what can often happen is you kill your opponent's minions, your opponent kills yours, nothing's on the board, Sylvanas gets played, they just remove it, and you're sad.
Right.
Very often, you are not going to be in a position to get enough value out of it. When I think of how you could get value out of it, I would think it would have to be a more aggressive list, where you've decided, okay, you can have the board, I'm just going to ignore it, and you can just spam clear my minions, whatever. I'll pay for the face damage. Now that you've got stuff on board, my Sylvanas will either, one, force you to trade your minions into it, or you're going to have to just simply play very inefficiently, or attempt to race, which odds are is not going to work out for them.
Right. And, she's, like you mentioned, Sylvanas is a lot stronger when your opponent is ahead on the board for, like, they take a tempo turn, they manage to stick some minions, remove yours, and then you play Sylvanas and you play right back into him. But it seems like this deck, we make a lot of incremental progress, and we're constantly removing, minions with efficient things like Arcane Missiles, Frostbolt early on in the game. It would seem like kind of a waste to have played these cards early on. And if we're playing Sylvanas from behind with this deck, it may be a tempo deck that we're playing here, but it's not quite like the Flamewaker tempo deck where we can hold like 10 cards in hand and then just dump everything.
I'd
right?
think of it more like value, I suppose. It's a lot more versatile, similar to Miracle Rogue, in where it has its main things it wants to do. It has a lot of other ways it can play. Like, you can play really aggressive. Like, you could just play Mana Wyrm into Juggler, and maybe then even to something smaller like Loot Hoarder, and then be like, okay, I'm just going to try race you and finish you off with fireballs and end the game quick. You can also then play for just maximum value, where while you don't have as many high-end stuff, you can make your opponent's trades a little more inefficient. Like something like Warrior, oftentimes they have to combo a lot of abilities together. Like maybe use like Whirlwind into execute, but ideally that one damage on the other minion that they're not executing is able to do something too. You can try set up so they don't get enough value out of cards like that, and potentially win that way as well.
Now we got a quick question in the chat here from our friend Chin Chin in the channel. He's wondering what is the non-secret package list? If we were to remove Kirin Tor and these 3 secrets, so that would be 5 cards total. If we open those slots up, what would you put in there if you had to?
I'm not entirely sure. Before I tried Harvest Golems, but I think realistically, I think you really just change the direction of the deck a lot. Like, I think you either commit to late game or early game, but that obviously means you're just saying certain matchups I'll win, certain matchups I'll lose. Like
Right.
I would say, if you're playing more late game, you could then add something like Antonidas. Uh, I would say if it's lighter play, it really depends on what you're versing. So if you feel like you could afford to go a bit slower, you could run Antonidas. You could actually Harrison. I remember is what I used to run originally, going into the ladder. But over time, and especially in the tournaments, I noticed is people were a lot faster with their decks, and Harrison was very often too slow. Like there are times versing a paladin, they would have already played Mukla, they'd have already played Kings on a Divine Shielded minion, and then Harrison is just too slow. You're gonna
Right.
need Ooze.
Right.
I think if maybe you're versing a bunch of Miracle Rogues, for example, you could definitely probably put a Harrison in there. If you're versing more aggro, I think you could probably put Argent Squires in there. Again, because it's still a fairly value-based deck, um, being able to just, Argent Squire, they Flame Imp, and then you just, like, ping it, for example. Or even if they play Voidwalker, Argent Squire into ping and double hit is...
Right.
It's alright.
Yeah,
I just...
it's something, right? It's efficient enough. Gives you some
Yeah,
board control.
it's hard to replace. And I guess the other thing is because it is 5 cards, um, it's hard because the main differences would be like you could decide either like maybe 2 Argent Squires, 2 Harvest Golems. This has you covered for the early game, but then for the late game, you need something like to really be able to swing things. I think Archmage is quite nice because it does have the potential to completely steal the game given that it lives, and because you're a deck that plays for the board, you're not as afraid to it dying to the board rather than you are the removal in the hand. So there are times this can stick. I have tried can, but I feel like it can definitely be ignored, and that's a big difference of Archmage. Archmage can't really be ignored. The other thing I would say is if you are removing that package, you might just remove even Ragnaros and just commit for the aggressive list, where you decide to run stuff like, double Leponome. I honestly don't know what other cards to go with it. Maybe Fairy Dragon, maybe other 1-drops, like, I don't know, Worgen or Argent Squire, really not sure, but Ice Lancers, right? The main point being, you probably would just end up having to commit face.
Yeah, that was a question I was going to ask you as well. What about Ice Lance? This is a card that can definitely give us a lot more reach, but and it can sometimes freeze something on the board as well. But it does require being comboed with another card. It is a 1 mana cost, so it gets dumped from our hand early, but it's also good with Apprentice. What do you think about this card?
Um, I'm really skeptical because I just think in way too many cases it can just be a 1 mana freeze a minion, which honestly I think I could try out more because admittedly there will be times where, quite rare, but you can use Frostbolt, just to freeze a minion, so you could just let your other minions hit face and potentially win the game in a turn or two. I think I can definitely consider Ice Sense. You could play around with it more. And the other thing being is because you have so much draw, you potentially will get more combos to activate it with. Like you'll be able to draw into Elemental, you'll be able to draw into the Frostbolts. You'll have more time to play this because obviously the point is you can't play this early on, or ideally you don't want to, otherwise it's playing as its freeze. You really want to play it generally if it's aggro to end the game, but the issue being is if you're aggro, you're not going to have enough draws realistically to get that much of a good combo out of it.
Right, you'd
I
rather
think
have like a 1 mana thing that controls the board immediately.
just do something
Yeah.
instantly, yeah,
Yeah.
like Argent Squire. I do think it's definitely worth considering. I think you can absolutely try it. I don't know how it will work out, but I think it's absolutely something you can test with. Because again, the point is it's a value deck. You can go late game, and because you can go late game and you'll draw a bunch more cards, you will probably find a combo to play with this. And the other thing I was also considering was Polymorph, which for mainly things like a can, potentially Sylvanas, maybe even a Giant. It wasn't consistent enough, and I would say Mirror Image does a decent job of replacing it. And in the main other scenarios it would be used, it would just be replaced by Fireball, which you already run 2 of. I would say it can potentially do a similar job when versing like Giant Torrents, or even like a Ragnaros. You can be facing a Ragnaros, a Giant, even a Twilight Drake, or Ancient of War. where all these scenarios you would love polymorph, but because you don't run that, you could potentially just Frostbolt into Ice Lance it and finish it off with whatever you have. But also the other big thing that it has that obviously polymorph doesn't have is the potential to just go face.
Right.
I think it's a decently versatile card. I think you could absolutely mess around with it, and I think I might just try it myself. I think we'd have to wait and see to see what happens with it.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. It's one of those things where also maybe just judging by the current meta, what people are playing, whether you feel like you need that extra 4 burn damage if you're getting
Yep.
blown off the board too early or something.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So, couple other questions on here. We've got one copy of Ooze in here. If we're playing on the ladder with this deck, and we're just not seeing a lot of weapon classes, which I know is shocking and rare. I'm sure we all face our fair share of rogues and warriors and paladins and shamans. Oh my! But are there any situations? What would you replace this for in the deck if you could?
Well, I guess depending on what you're versing, and I think if there's any times where I'm noticing there's not a bunch of weapons, it's got to be Zoo. So in that case, I think your options would at that point be Argent Squire. I think is probably number one. Potentially Arcane Explosion. I've definitely noticed there's few scenarios where I'm like, man, I wish I had an Arcane Explosion. But again, Arcane Missiles generally does what it does better anyway, and sooner. Argent Squire is just more consistent, something you can actually just play proactively on turn one. Harvest Golem, I think at times can be too slow. The other big thing about the one drop is having something to potentially protect your Juggler and stuff. Also on turn 3, you may not mind just playing like ping Arcane Missiles. So realistically, I think if you're not versing weapons, you're versing Zoo, probably run Argent Squire, because again, you also don't mind pinging that much. Like what can often happen is maybe you have like a Juggler in hand, and maybe you want to wait for like a mirror image combo. So you can go like Squire, ping, ping, ping until you feel comfortable with like going into like Juggler image, or maybe Juggler Mana Wyrm image, or Juggler Apprentice image.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. And you don't, the Argent Squire doesn't need to be part of that Juggler combo either. It can, later on in the game if we want it to be. But like you say, securing the board just a little bit before playing one of those minions so that they don't get away with murder by trading a Leper Gnome into our Knife Juggler on turn 2 in like a, swingy board-based matchup. The Argent Squire can just do a lot of work in those situations.
Well, basically, Argent Squire is a near definition of a tempo card, I would say.
Right, just absolutely secures the board. It's annoying to deal with. It may eat up a ton of resources if somebody's going to skip Wild Growthing and hero power down the Argent Squire instead.
Saving you 2 pings is, I would say, saving at least 1 ping would be the main way I think of it. Because when versing a Zoo, and you're up against, like you said, Leper Gnome, the most common thing I would do is consider you ping on 2, but then they play more and more stuff. The board is getting built up, and unless you get a great turn with like as I said, Juggler image missiles, then you're not really in much of a secure spot. And I feel like with the Argent Squire, because of the Divine Shield and because of your hero power, you don't mind the lack of damage because you can always make up for that with your hero power.
Right. Other decks have the opportunities to buff creatures like Argent Squire, whether it's with running it with abusive or some of the class specific buffs. But we have a hero power that can affect the board, right? So there are a lot of situations in which this 1 damage ping isn't going to kill something like Flame Imp, but then we have hero power to just follow it up, and we're able to do that. And the hero power gets behind taunts, so if we get to bump into something with Argent Squire, then we always have that threat of hero powering afterward.
Yep.
Talking just real quick about mulligan choices here. I don't remember what game it was, but I think in the tournament one of the games you kept a secret in your opening hand, and I was curious about when we have this Kirin Tor Mirror Entity Counterspell package that can be, like we've said, totally backbreaking sometimes. Do we prioritize keeping these in our mulligan, or is that just kind of like a situational thing? If you got both, keep them. If you got only one, don't keep either one.
Generally, if I would say obviously keep both. Obviously, that's the main point. Generally, if you have one, don't keep. I would say, depending on your matchup, you can consider keeping. I often think you don't need to go too hard for one drops because you only have 2 of them anyway. I would think, like, when you consider your turn free options, if you're like Kirin Tor is basically the best thing you can play on turn free. You don't really have many options, so it's like if you already have a decent 2-drop, like maybe Loot Hoarder, then you can be fine playing Kirin Tor. The main concern may be if you're versing aggressive decks where you feel like, oh, they're going to get the board, you need to focus more on getting removal or even Mana Wyrm, and then the removal being like Arcane Missiles or Frostbolt or something. But I think if you're versing something that you can take a little more time with, then just having the free drop is all right because it's just simply able to curve out. And while at the same time you could say you could mulligan it to draw into Mana Wyrm, that's only giving you one draw. And while drawing up to turn free, you potentially draw into a secret, which then makes your turn free way bigger. When I would say it comes to keeping specifically a secret without Kirin Tor, I'd think I couldn't really imagine ever keeping Counterspell, and I think Mirror Entity you would only do specifically if you know what you're versing, so I'd argue Tournament format. If you're versing like a handlock, but at the same time you are giving away what card you have, pretty much by keeping it. So still very dangerous, and you'd still want to curve out ideally too. So maybe your hand would have to be like Mana Wyrm, Juggler, Mirror Entity, but again, because they probably know it's Mirror Entity, they may just Hellfire and you'll be sad. So I think you very rarely ever just keep a secret by itself unless you're just feeling super greedy and praying you just draw Kirin Tor.
Yeah,
I don't think it's ever right.
Yeah, and one of the things that you were just mentioning too is these secrets are good at backing up your board. If you've built a modest board already, managed to secure 1 or 2 minions, then being able to play the Kirin Tor plus Counterspell guarantees you keep that board. But if we just go for Kirin Tor and Counterspell or Kirin Tor and Mirror Entity in our opening hand by mulliganing for those things rather than mulliganing for those early creatures, it's pretty sad to play Kirin Tor on 3 with a Counterspell when you don't have a board to protect, right? So it seems like the kind of thing that you would probably be more interested in finding early ways or cheap things that you can play out on a good tempo turn than it is to be searching for a hard mulligan, trying to find Kirin Tor, combo and just win the game outright with that.
Yeah, it depends on what you're versing still. Like if you're versing Zoo, then that's the kind of deck where I can start snowballing if you don't deal with like you can't just play 1 minion here and there and hope to win. You need to get your value. Other decks, I think it's okay because a lot of the times what can happen is if you're not really being reactive on 10 free, then odds are you're just playing a 2-drop anyway. It's like you'll play like Juggler followed up with Loot Hoarder. So like oftentimes a Kirin Tor on its own for turn 3 specifically is generally quite decent. But again, depending on what you're versing, and if you are versing something that's more aggressive that you'd want to mulligan for removal, then well, you don't need to worry. You just mulligan it then.
Right.
You'll be fine.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about this deck structure and why some of these cards are included. I want to move on a little bit to kind of some of the matchups that we're likely to face and the mulligans that we'd like to have for those decks.
Alright.
So let's start at the top here with the 2 notorious offenders. We've got Miracle Rogue and Combo Druid. So against Rogue, what's our game plan and what do we want to keep in our opening hand?
Miracle Rogue, it's a little rough, I would say. You kind of just have to pray for the best. Just hope that not enough bad stuff goes wrong. Like, there are times you probably just have to play Juggler on 2 and just pray they don't have a way to remove it. And if they did have a way to remove it, then odds are it's not safe any later anyway.
Right.
A thing I would say, I'll argue you could potentially do is if you are scared on turn 2 that they're going to like coin SI, you can maybe wait a turn for them to try play it raw on turn 3, and then hope that you can then Frostbolt it and then play the minions later.
Right.
Overall, I think it's there's not too much you can do. I would say Mana Wyrm is a really big deal since it's a card that won't get contested right away, and you could potentially, even on turn 1 with the coin, just pair it up with a mirror image and make it a really hard minion to deal with. I would say Frostbolt keep at least one, probably not two, because you do want minions. One is usually good enough to deal with the 3-mana cards, since they only have three drops, and other than that, no 2 drops really, no 4 drops, so you don't need to worry as much about their board. So one Frostbolt is usually enough. I would say if you can get a Kirin Tor mirror entity, that will be absolutely massive, because generally, like, almost any minion you're happy to get, and if they do play a minion, they're not playing removal most likely to deal with your Kirin Tor, and you're in a super solid spot. Also, just generally throwing off their turns, and if they don't have a minion, and they end up in a position where, let's say they have to then auctioneer Coin Conceal, but then they can't deal with your auctioneer, they're in a really dangerous spot. I'm not entirely sure what to mulligan for. I think the main thing I'm wondering is, do you want to go for Kirin Tor plus Mirror Entity? Because I think that's your main big way to swing the game in your favor. Other than that, I would say Mana Wyrm. I think mainly paired with Mirror Image. Mirror Image it's a bit rough because you can't get as much value, being that they can just bypass your taunts with cards like Backstab, Abyss, and their SI7 agent. I think you could maybe argue towards Water Elemental, as it's quite sticky. I think it may be too slow though. Generally, I think turn 4 is too slow. 4 drops you're expecting to draw into by turn 4 anyway. You want to play stuff sooner. Loot Hoarder is honestly one of the main things that come to mind, because your other 2 drops, as I mentioned, too likely to just die to Backstab, too likely to die to SI. Loot Hoarder, while yes, it will just die to the hero power, I think it's still an overall pretty decent option.
Right, everything
your
you play
mulligan's
is
quite
going to
rough.
get everything you play is going to get removed, right?
It's really rough.
May as well cycle one of the things that you're going to get removed. I would say Swamp Ooze seems like a no-brainer to keep against Rogue, of course, as well.
Yeah, I think to just finalize and answer the question mainly, I'd say Mana Wyrm, pretty much any 2-drop. Kirin Tor, I think maybe it could depend on if you already have 1 or 2 drops. Maybe if you're going second, I think there's more merit to it if you're mulliganing the rest of your hand, because it's just that much more likely to draw a secret.
Right.
If you draw a secret with it, I would absolutely keep Kirin Tor. Even if it's just Counterspell, I think if you can Counterspell a Backstab Prep, that's usually going to do enough. Also, I don't fully remember if you Counterspell a spell, if they're still able to get combo from that. So I don't know if maybe someone in chat can answer that.
Yeah, actually, it's a good question. I don't see Counterspell so often enough that I actually even know. Well, I don't want to speculate because then I'll sound stupid one way or another. But yeah, the other thing here too is Kirin Tor and some of these other things. If we can clog the board up early on with these 3 health minions, Mana Wyrm and Kirin Tor, yes, they do die to Backstab hero power, but Kirin Tor plus Counterspell, like you mentioned, even if we're counterspelling a Backstab, the Kirin Tor is still 3 health, and that's kind of hard to remove, right? It's probably going to involve a hero power or something like that. And the payoff is that if we get to a later turn, if we get to turn 4 contested, whatever it is, being able to play Water Elemental onto either an empty board or a board in which we already have things is likely to be a problem for our opponent, right? The only good answer is really just sap for a Water Elemental, and even then, we're talking about, it's 4 mana, it's a 4 mana minion, but at the same time, going into turn 5, playing a Water Elemental, like replaying it after it's been sapped, it's not the worst thing in the world, right? It's still a 6 health minion that's going to be a real pain in the ass for them to do anything about.
Other things, though, also in some Miracle Rogue, there's a few things to mention. One is the more cards they have as removal, which will be sad for you, will also mean the less likely it is that they will actually have an Auctioneer plus Conceal. And also, a lot of this removal is not going to be cyclable stuff, like Backstab SI. These are the main things they're afraid of, not cyclable. It's going to be less likely that they're going to get that Auctioneer in the first place. So when it does then come down to, you get to the point where you can Water Elemental, when you're not as afraid of Auctioneer, you're in a pretty solid spot. Like a water elemental is very, very strong into rogue. It's like, and yes, even if they sap it, again, the point was if they have auctioneer, it's nearly like just you straight up lose the game where you don't. And again, if that means they have sap, and on top of like probably the backstab or side, a lot more unlikely for them to have auctioneer. So if you could just play water elemental again, it's like you're in a pretty decent spot. I think, yeah, this is the main thing that I did overlook was knowing that like if they have to play for removal, then they can't play as much for auctioneer. And generally, if you're afraid of auctioneer conceal, that means it's less likely that they're going to have cards like backstab and SI. Um, so a lot of the times, like your 2-drops, while they won't get that much value, they can be all right, and you just have to suck it up and be like, okay, they're not as good as I'd like them to be, but they can be good enough. Even if in a scenario where they deadly poison, trade into both 2-drops, just simply that 6 damage can definitely make a noticeable difference. So you end up eventually getting the water elemental into then the Azure Drake, and then you're starting to realize, hey, I can end the game with like fireballs and frostbolts.
Right. And I think, this you bring up a very important point about playing against Rogue in general. Is that I'm sure we've all played the games against Rogue where they have every single answer to everything that we have, and we feel helpless. Now, it's having played Rogue, played Miracle Rogue, I know that that's just not always the case. So there are
Yep.
two things. Number one is we can't just play in fear that they'll always have the answer, because if we do, then they're just going to wait until turn 5, 6, 7, when instead of having the answer, now they're going to have the answer that draws a card for them as well, right? So making them spend those resources early, even if it feels really bad to get backstab aside, like you say, those aren't cycling. And backstab is a card that could be 0 mana draw a card and deal 2 damage. If we're not drawing it out with our Juggler or with our Apprentice or whatever we want to in the early game, then they're just going to play it for more value later on, right? A rogue isn't going to be unhappy about sitting on 10 cards going into their Gadget Zan turn. We'd rather
Well,
waste those beforehand.
well, it's not about that they're going to get more value from it later on. It's more of like what people are actually being afraid of is like you need to think of the actual game more. It's like you can't be afraid of absolutely everything, otherwise you're just afraid that your opponent has literally the perfect hand no matter what. Like they
Right.
can't mulligan their hand based on what you draw. Like they can't just specifically counter what you have in hand every time. Like a lot of times decks they want to be proactive, not just reactive. Like
Right.
he can't say, "Hey, I'm gonna mulligan for backstep SI and realize, hey, you don't have 2-drops. I'm gonna then mulligan them again and go for auctioneer conceal." Like they can't play for all of these things. It's they're oftentimes as Miracle Rogue, you're committing to auctioneer conceal or you're committing to removal. You're very unlikely to be able to play for both.
Right.
And maybe in this matchup you can try say both, but odds are that means their draws aren't going to be as consistent. So hey, if there's a backstep SI, those early turns are going to be really rough, but that doesn't mean the later turns are going to be as rough.
Right.
It means they are less likely to have auctioneer conceal. You don't have to be as afraid of it. You are not out of the game. And while if then they are playing for auctioneer conceal, that means you can then potentially snowball with your juggler and your apprentice, and you can be like, hey, I can now potentially erase you. Basically, the rogue is not going to be in that secure of a position. Like they just simply have to get lucky, which this can just be said again about anything.
Exactly. Any deck can get lucky and have the perfect draws against whatever we're playing. That's not
Yep.
a unique thing to Rogue. They do have a lot of
Yep.
tools and they do have a lot of cycling once they get to Gadget Zan, but they can't. They don't start with a 10-card hand that has Gadget Zan in it and Conceal, right? They have to make it there somehow, and they're either going to have to sacrifice early game removal to ensure they have it in their hand, or they're going to play a hand with early game removal and not know if they're going to get the auctioneer in time.
Yep. Basically, that's the biggest thing to remember. They don't have 10 cards in hand. They have like 4. You don't need to be that scared.
Yeah. Okay, so what about Druid? If we're playing against, let's just say, a standard combo Druid, what kinds of cards are we looking for in our opener?
Kind of same general thing. A lot of the times, if like the 2-drops, you just can't protect them. Like you can't protect it against Wrath. There's nothing you can do about it. You can't protect it against Innovate Keeper. If they have it, they have it. But at times, if they rough 2-drop, just trading 2 for 2, that could mean they're not using Wild Growth. Or if they do Keeper, well, they also need to have Innovate.
Right.
Or if they and this is another reason why Kirin Tor can be good, is specifically to trade into Keeper.
Yeah, that's the
Um,
stat line lines up really well, and Druid
yeah.
being as they kind of want to just play the big thing every turn. They don't want to go into turn 5 and have to think, well, I have Druid of the Claw in hand, but there's a 4/1 Kirin Tor on the board, right? They don't really want to have
You
to
can
make
make
that
things very
choice.
awkward for the Druid
Yeah,
with those kinds of stat lines. The other thing being also with its stat line as a 4/3, well, it dies to Wrath. Odds are they're probably already trying to Wrath a 2-drop anyway.
right,
So again, the kind of situation where for them to really be able to counter your stuff, like they can counter a thing here and there, but they can't counter everything. Like
right.
if they innovate Keeper, 2 specific cards they needed to have, then you can also have 2 specific cards. Or it doesn't even need to be that specific. Like your 2-drop could be any 2-drop, or probably not Loot Hoarder, just a free 2 into Kirin Tor, and then or instantly they're sad. And
Right,
even then, you have the chance to get a Seeker on top of that. So
right,
you're not, just if you look at the game overall, like your bad situation is generally, for one, quite unlikely, and for two, if you find yourself in that, odds are it's not going to be as bad later on, and you can always come back.
right. Drawing into cards that have synergy with one another always feels good as well. If you have a
Yep,
rough opening hand, the ability to draw spell damage minions like Thalnos or Drake plus spell damage, that can help out a lot. Same thing with
absolutely.
some of these minions is that we don't have to play Mana Wyrm on turn 1 and let it run out of control and get to 5/3 and win the game right away. It can be played later on in the game, and it's still a threat on turn 5 just as much as it is on turn 1 if we get a chance to play it.
I think
Yeah,
if
good.
I am talking about a card like Mana Worm, it's a bit risky because I would say when it comes to later in the game, that's when you're playing your bigger minions. Like that may be a turn when you like 10-6. It's probably going to be Water Elemental plus 2-drop or Water Elemental removal or Water Elemental ping or whatever. You're not really getting to the point where you're unloading. And generally, if you do play it on turn 1, it it will just straight up trade for a 2-drop, if not potentially be better because of the 1 extra health, making it even harder for certain people to deal with. While Manawam is a card that is still great at any time of the game, um, it can definitely be more lacking at the end of the game where it's just a 1 free. Whereas, still, again, always remember just how good this can be on turn 1. Like, it can end up having up to, like, I mean, I guess with the Ice Lancers, it will have more, but like up to +5 attack. And that was another
Right.
reason why I like the idea of Temper Mage, is look at all these cards and notice how many of them ends up getting nerfed. Now,
Yeah.
obviously, that's because as more cards came out, more smaller spells came out to synergize them with. You don't have as many small spells, but at the same time, other classes don't have much stuff either. You still have a decent amount. Mana Worm can still snowball pretty damn good.
Yeah, at 3 health, it trades with pretty much anything an opponent can play on turn 1 except for Flame Imp,
Potentially, yeah.
right? And so being able to trade with Abusive Sergeants or Leper Gnomes or being able to ping off the Argent Squire's shield, which you can combine with your hero power. It doesn't have to get insane value, the Mana Worm, by getting up to a large attack. It can just get insane value out of the merit of being a 1/3 on turn 1, right?
Yeah. It's got a lot of just straight up just strong card.
Yeah. Okay, so I wanted to quickly cover the kind of the control matchups and sort of the Zooier matchups as well, and what we're mulliganing for. So, in some of these slow matchups like Control Warrior, Priest, Mid Range Shaman, Control Paladin, what are we looking for in our opening hand? Do we want cards like Drake and Water Elemental, or are we still going for this low curve with Mana Worm?
You may have to go one deck at a time. I think a reoccurring theme with a lot more control decks is you have to accept that like you're not going to get as much value out of certain cards. Like a War Axe may just kill a 2-drop. I would still say generally always keep at least 1 2-drop. Depending on your matchup, I could say you may keep multiple. Against Zulux, I would be a lot more hesitant to keeping a 2-drop. I think you can still keep at least one, but you're not expecting to play a 2-drop on turn 3. Whereas in something like Control Warrior, you don't mind as much playing a 2-drop on turn 3.
Right.
You desperately want a lot more early game stuff like your Mana Worms, your Arcane Missiles. Frostbolt is more so kind of trades 1-to-1, and you really kind of want to go for more value. Juggler you would keep, but you really, really want to be able to get more value out of it. Like if you can combo it with mirror images, that's a big way to come back.
Yeah.
Even against just simply any deck in general, it's good because, I mean, for one, the jugglers can be decent. Even if jugglers don't do enough, you're at the very least protecting your board with the taunts. And then if, let's say, they then play minions, you just get jugglers and can just control the board.
Right. Kind of the same way a hunter deck would keep Unleash the Hounds or Knife Juggler in their opening hand, but they
Yeah,
wouldn't want to play Unleash on 3, right? They're going to save
yeah,
it for turn 5 and play it together with something that's just kind of assembling parts of a combo, as opposed to playing the combo out one piece at a time, like Juggler on 2, Mirror Image on 1 kind of thing.
yeah. It is a bit rougher because Hunter has tracking, and also they get to wait till turn 5, and also have the other combo being Explosive Trap.
Right.
Whereas I could say your version of Explosive Trap, you could think more of Arcane Missiles in the sense as it's just a decent way to clear early game stuff.
Right.
I don't know how to say for exact mulligans. I would think against slower stuff, you can consider the Kirin Tor.
Mm-hmm.
The combo itself, I think I would nearly almost keep. I think you could argue if you're specifically versing maybe Hunter, you don't have to keep it. But I
Mm-hmm.
do think even against Hunter it can be alright, because often what can happen, they play 1-drop, you ping it, they hero power, so you're fine to do nothing, and then they do whatever, you play Kirin Tor. Other
Right.
problem also being is, for one, it's an easy bird target, and it will trigger a secret, so I think you may not want to play it into Hunter, actually.
Yeah, these
Um,
being able for them to just get more charges off of their bow always feels bad. That said, Mirror Entity, can snag against mid-range hunter. It can snag some pretty valuable minions as well, like the Tiger or the Savannah High Mane would be obviously ideal targets. But even just playing Kirin Tor and being able to counterspell Animal Companion seems like it's still pretty good. But like you say, it just feels bad when you give them bow charges as well. So maybe not Kirin Tor.
I would say specifically into more slower matchups if it's Control Warrior, Ramp Druid, probably even Miracle Rogue, maybe. These are all things to consider Kirin Tor. Anything aggressive, it's too slow, not good enough.
Yeah.
A card like Arcane Intellect, I think, would be very niche. I think you would almost never keep. I think a rare scenario could be a case if, let's say, you have a hand that consists of something like Mana Worm, Sorcerer's Apprentice, and Mirror Image. So it's like, you're able to dump your hand and get the board, but this is like just super niche. In many other
Right.
cases, it's not going to happen. Like if it's something even just Mana Worm plus Coin Mirror Image, you'd rather go to have a 2-drop than at that point anyway. The idea is like, do you really need that card draw early on? Probably not, because the idea is you want to get minions out or potentially spells depending on the deck you're facing to use reactively. Like Arcane Intellect is, as you could imagine, when you're nearing the end game, like it's the main card you want at the end of the game. Either like simply you've run out of cards, or you want to potentially draw into that final fireball to finish off your opponent.
Right. Um, no, and one thing also that I'm hearing you say that I think is valuable across all classes, but certainly with some decks more so than others, is that you want to read the texture of your hand when you're making mulligan choices. You don't just
Yep.
blindly say, I want this card or that card because it's going to win for me. That might be true in Standard and Wild, is that there are certain cards that it's just like, okay, I keep Reno when I'm playing against a Rogue, or
Yep.
something in Wild. But when we're talking about Classic, it's a lot more about trying to find valuable synergies between our cards,
Yep.
as opposed to trying to find the card that wins the matchup. And so it sounds like, Kirin Tor seems like it's pretty reasonable sometimes with if you hold another secret, or Arcane Intellect is okay if you know that you're going to dump your hand. Some of these sort of these ideas of just playing the deck, getting some experience with it, knowing what your opponent's going to play, knowing how your deck works, how all the pieces work together. That seems like it's a lot more valuable than trying to make some
Yeah.
dogmatic decisions about when we do or do not mulligan these things.
I'd say a lot more of it can come down to like the flow of like how you expect the start of the game to go. So again, stuff like Warrior and Ramchwood, stuff that's rather slow. You don't need to play for as much reactive stuff. Those games you could play a lot more for value. And then decks that are more aggressive, you want to probably try play to still outvalue them, but in doing so, you're doing it by getting early game removal. And a lot of times, I think while you would probably want to keep nearly every 2-drop, I think that's the main decision making, because a lot of your other choices are going to be quite obvious. I think the 2-drops are when it gets to be a bit more of a question. Like,
Right.
which ones do you keep, or what happens when, let's say, you have like 2-drops in your hand, and do you keep them both?
Yeah, exactly.
There will be some times where like Apprentice and Juggler, none of them you can expect to get any value too quickly. You're thinking it's like, well, if it sticks a lot around long enough, it may be you may be able to find a use for it later down the line, but odds are that's not going to happen in the first place. Um, Really can just depend on what else you have in hand and what your matchup is.
Right.
Like, I think if it's a slower matchup, especially I think if it's a warrior, you don't need to keep double 2-drop. Like, unless it's Ooze. Like, you're gonna be scared of a war axe,
Right.
and other things like Kirin Tor you can get a lot more value from. And even if you have Arcane Intellect on free, I think it's most fine to do that when versing a warrior, and they already have a war axe. So whatever you play is just gonna get eaten anyway. You can get the Arcane Intellect out of the way. You play on curve, potentially even water early, and if that lives, you can then have a safe 2-drop in the future.
Right, and playing Arcane Intellect on 3 also allows us to just draw into the multiple tools that we can use at once, where we can
Yeah.
play Mirror Image with Mana Wyrm together, right? If we play Arcane Intellect and draw something like that, or if we hold a Mana Wyrm and we're just looking for Mirror Image, ways that we can
Yeah.
kind of play a couple things at once and have those choices available to us rather than having to play with the limited cards that we have in our hand.
I would say an easier example of not keeping double 2-drop would be something like Face Hunter, where for one, if they do stick, then he gets to explosive trap them. A lot more of the time, Face Hunter is something you can definitely play more for value. You don't need to just play a random free 2. You can generally ping almost any of their creatures. The only ones you really can't would be like a Leok or Misha, which then hopefully you have Frostbolt for. If not, just you can Frostbolt a Juggler. But cards like Mana Wyrm, you'll steal the game. Juggler, if comboed with Mirror Image, can be quite good. I would be very careful with that. As you mentioned in the tournament, how I just like ping twice in a row, and you were saying I should just Apprentice, Mirror Image, plus Arcane Missiles. I was thinking, the main way I lose is Explosive Trap. I
Yeah.
don't need to do that. If
Yeah.
I just ping, 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 he's doing no damage. I still have minions I can play. Like, he's just hero powering. That he's not doing nearly anything. Like, I am in a very fine position. I don't need to overcommit. The Arcane Missiles, it will always be good later against a Hunter. Eventually, he's going to have to play something like Wolf Rider or Arcane Golem or even just more 1-drops. Like, Arcane Missiles will always be good. There is no rush. And the thing with the mirror images is you did mention how in the Face Hunter matchup it would get worse later. I try to make sure I was very careful with when I played it. I didn't want to play it too soon for him to get enough value out of Explosive Trap, but I didn't want to play it too late to where he would be able to Hounds.
Right.
And on turn 4, when I could use it at pretty much just the right time, because it was at the point where if he did Explosive, I already have more minions I could play. I've already dealt with his minions. At that point, most likely the read would be something like Unleash, which, well, he can't get any value out of now. So yeah, I would say a big thing with Mirror Image is be careful of the timing of when you use it. Like, a lot of times you either really need the juggles or you really need to like protect other minions.
Yeah.
Like, it could be something like you're protecting an Apprentice, so then you could combo spells next turn, or playing it with a Juggler means you can get juggles in the future later, which is especially good against Zoo.
Yeah, absolutely. I do notice that you took a pretty value-oriented, conservative, whatever approach to playing some of these cards out. And I guess one of my big takeaways from watching that was that we evaluate the board state as it is, and we kind of evaluate the board state at the end after all of these different choices we can make. And if we're ahead, we don't need to commit anymore. We just need to stay a little bit ahead with this deck, and we can even leave some of our mana open just because we don't want to open ourselves up. We don't have that many creatures. We don't have a great way to generate creatures that are powerful with this deck. We have a limited number of creatures that we have to play with. So the ones that we do have, we have to protect them properly.
You want to preserve them. The point is, this is a lot more, I'll consider, a value-oriented deck. Each card it has the potential to do a ton. If you look at nearly every single card, like, you can see a moment where it really, really shines. Maybe it needs to combo with like one or two other cards, but the amount of cards it needs to combo with, it's not that many. Like, there are a lot of times where you can get value. It's more of like, how much can you get value now versus later? Also being, will this set me back? The main one being, if I mirror image, he's going to AoE, I'm going to lose the game. I'm already in a good position. He needs to do something, and odds are if he does something, like maybe play a minion, I just fireball it, I am still ahead, and as I'm still ahead, the game is just getting nearer and nearer to me winning. He's going to just have to get more and more desperate. I do not need to take any risks. I am not in a desperate position whatsoever. I can just play conservatively and just maximize value, don't throw the game.
Yeah. Well, that's a lot of really valuable information on this deck. I not only learned a lot watching you in the tournament, but from our discussion here today as well. I'm wondering if you feel like playing a couple of games and maybe showing it off for the folks. All right, cool. So while you're waiting to queue up there, one question that I had sort of as a follow-up to all of these is if you could just generally give some advice to people, especially those who have tried Tempo Mage and are struggling just a little bit with this deck. What advice would you give them when they're playing this?
I would say play more for value. The main thing that I like to think back to is Arena, where it's like you can't really aim for like a specific type of deck, so it's like you just work with what you got, and generally, you can't commit to a full control. You can't really commit to full aggro. It's like you generally just need to make the most of the cards you've got.
Right.
And I would say it's generally the same thing with this deck as well. You don't need to play specifically to win at like any point of the game or anything. Just play to make the most of what you got.
Yeah, and especially for a deck that's missing, or that's not as minion heavy as other tempo-oriented decks are, it makes sense again to try and preserve those minions. Yeah, obviously your opponent's going to have removal no matter what, but if they do have removal, playing minions on a turn when it's awkward for them to deal with all of the minions that you play at once, or backing up your board with a secret like Counterspell or Mirror Entity. So even if you get wiped, maybe you counter that spell, or maybe you have something lined up to help you grab the board after they play that.
So I'm in a game now, so you can spectate.
Fantastic.
So at the moment, versing Rogue, the main consideration is just what deck is he? Is he Miracle or the generally backspace Rogue? Normally it's easy to just consider Miracle. Not gonna metagame this too hard, so we're just gonna assume mainly it's Miracle. Probably don't want to keep any of these. If you knew it was backspace, or as you can just call aggro Rogue, you could strongly consider the missiles a lot more, but because I think it's a lot more likely to be Miracle, and the average Rogue would be, you would just not looking at all.
Mm-hmm.
At this point, he's kept 2 cards, and I think, I would say given that I versed this person enough, I think he's probably more sure that I'm playing Tempo than I am playing Freeze Mage, so I would think he's a lot more likely to keep cards like Backstabber Asai.
Right.
So he has kept those 2. I think if I play Apprentice, it's probably going to end up dying. I could also argue that I potentially play these 2 back to back, so if I'm going to play Apprentice, maybe just get out of the way. But the strongest consideration is if I do play Loot Hoarder, I can potentially then get a Kirin Tor Mage. The other thing being is if he decides to SI this turn and coin it, it's going to be a lot worse. And then the last thing being is their main 10 free play being Fan of Knives means it's Probably. Actually, never mind. It's actually always be worse as fan because he just hero powers regardless.
Right.
Not sure if it matters as much. I mainly focus more on backstep SI, I guess. The main consideration being the free drop I want to draw into. Um, at this point, decision being, I can't play Counterspell. Really, he's got the coin, and eventually, when he does play a spell, he's gonna know because he's gonna play a card next turn. Even if it's just Phantacycle, then he trades one card for one. He's not that unhappy with that.
Hmm.
I think best I can do is potentially just get a free drop. I think I just have to suck it up.
Yeah, I think Mirror Entity makes a lot of sense here. Going into a rogue turn 3 with 28 health, they're okay playing Earthen Ring. They're okay playing SI. If they play Thalnos, then you're in a good spot. Oh,
Okay, so it looks like it is potentially aggro. He hasn't played it at minion until 10 free. The hero power on 2 makes sense though. He did keep these 2 cards, which I would have imagined if it was aggro, they would have been played by now. But
right.
I mean, with the Mukla, it looks very convincing that it is aggro. Um, Other thing to say with the Apprentice over Mirror Entity is by the time Mirror Entity would be played, by like turn 6 or so, the main thing I may be afraid of would perhaps be like a board clear. So maybe it could be something like a Deadly Poison Blade Flurry. Um, Whereas the Apprentice can be used, it has more potential to be used reactively. Or even I can perhaps save it, play other things, maybe my board gets wiped and then I play later. I think the Mirror Entity versus Apprentice is not as clear. I think it could possibly go either way. I'm honestly not fully sure. This turn, if this is the aggro rogue, then there's not going to be a bigger minion to fireball than Mukla. So
Right.
this is going to be the time to play it. I'm not trying to race him, so I'm not worried about it as a finisher.
Mhm.
If I'm gonna think about Water Elemental, just seems too greedy. It could still be decent later. I need to play a bit more defensive against this because if you give them an inch, they take a mile kind of thing.
Right.
It's generally how aggressive decks go, especially something like Rogue running cards like Sap and Backstab. So got to be quite careful about those. And it also looks like the Apprentice keep is paying off a lot more. Being that I can play it with these bananas later in the game.
Right, yeah, those bananas might come in handy there, whether it's an unsapped water elemental or maybe just value trading in with like Thalnos Apprentice.
I'm really thinking there's not going to be much value to be gained. I'm sort of thinking that any cards I play would probably be near instantly removed, or I'm not going to be able to like trade much into his minions as they're probably going to continue just having 1 health.
Right,
My main concern is I really want to clear the board. I'm thinking any minion I play could simply be destroyed with like Eviscerate. Ooze I don't think is good enough, and I really wouldn't be surprised if he had a Assassin's Blade. Like considering he's kept both of these cards this whole time,
right,
he maybe he's playing to get Assassin's Blade because if it's a freeze mage, that card is going to be effectively 12 damage, which he could consider worth it. So I think the threat of Assassin's Blade is very much there. I do want to kind of play around it. Main consideration, I'm thinking I hero power, but then either I Apprentice or Bloodmage.
You wouldn't consider.
Which of the two I do?
So you're thinking keep the Ooze for the Assassin's Blade next turn?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Um, I would say I want to go Bloodmage because, for one, the attack is just not making any difference whatsoever.
Right.
And 2, I really, really need to draw into certain cards. Like Arcane Missiles will be near game winning for me. Knife Juggler would be alright. Just without like specifically Juggler plus a mirror image, it's a bit rough. I do think you could definitely consider Apprentice. But I am thinking he hasn't played a lot of cards. Some he's held on to for some time, so I wouldn't be surprised if there was something like an Eviscerate, a Sap, Backstab, SI, or Deadly Poison. So I would expect my Apprentice to be fairly easily removed, so I do care about the card draw more. Other thing being is because I didn't have any spell damage in my hand, the spell damage I get from my minion was not going to look like it would get much value, so
Right.
not as afraid of that. Also, of course, even if I do draw into spells like I do now, can still combo them with the Apprentice, so Apprentice still gets good value.
Right, exactly. Is that it's not like this. It's not like the spell damage is that much more important than playing a card like this for free, right?
Okay, well, it looks like he's trying to mill me. So, okay, at this point, he's playing very aggressively. Now, this is very unfortunate because I didn't draw Mirror Image, that is completely fine. That is not completely fine at all. I would really like Missiles. Mirror Image would just straight up be game winning. It
Right.
forces out Deadly Poison, Blade Flurry. Right away, it leaves him with nothing. He would only have 3 mana left. He's already used Muckler. He'd be in a terrible position if I was able to get that combo off. And obviously I could finish off with like Missiles, Hero Power or something.
Right.
I would be in a super good position. At this point, he's already played the one Shadow Step. I am mainly thinking of wanting to deal with the Squire. Now, Arcane Missiles comes to mind, that's getting played. The combo of how I use these spells, I'm thinking. Knife Juggler into Apprentice, into Missiles. Difference being, do I Frostbolt versus Hero Power? So I'll get 4 Juggles. Well, I need to get 4. It's all land. But I will get only 4, and then 1 where I can choose where it goes. I need to do this first. Actually, no, I don't need to do this. I was going to play this first. I'm going to go with just Frostbolting it.
This seems like the safest choice that we can make. We're only getting 1 extra ping there. Yeah, this seems good. Now, who
I'm
do
not
you
too sure what to do with the banana.
Yeah.
I wasn't too sure of the banana. Also, just didn't have enough time. I'm trying to rethink this turn. I didn't fully go through it.
Well, it's
So
tough.
the difference.
If you catastrophically miss though, then the play without the Frostbolt just seems so greedy. It's like a chance. It's just a single out for you to just lose the game. So this seems like it's pretty consistent.
Rethink. Okay, so on average, missiles would hit 1 each. There'd be 2 minions left. I'd fire blast 1. So it's unlikely to lead them all up. So basically, I'm trading out Frostbolt to secure a kill 1, which is securing that I have a minion on board. So basically, do I think Frostbolt is worth, like, I think, I don't know the exact odds, I think maybe like a 60% chance of keeping one of my cards on board. Honestly, probably yes. Because the chance of Frostbolt being useful later is honestly not all that likely because, well, as pretty much you're seeing right here, all this means have 1 health.
Right.
And so they will just get pinged anyway.
Right.
Is not going to get much value out of it.
Right.
It looks like he's not planning to clear the board. I was thinking maybe there'll be like a Deadly Poison or something, but no. And he still kept these 2 cards from the start of the game, so my read for like Assassin's Blade especially is very, very strong. I'm very much expecting Assassin's Blade, so I am thinking we need to get this Water Elemental on the board. He needs to be frozen.
Absolutely.
I am thinking, what do I do from there? I'm thinking if I Counterspell, can make sure he doesn't sap. I am also honestly thinking there is a chance he may not even be running sap. The other thing though is the Ooze, because if the Water Elemental sticks, I can just Ooze him right away.
Exactly.
The only way he gets rid of the Water Elemental is if he saps, but unfortunately I can't play these both in the same turn. So I think I may just have to gamble that he doesn't have the sap on top of the Water Elemental. This also does get me 2 Juggles. I'll start off by playing the Water Ellie.
Yep. There's also a chance to ping here as well.
Yeah.
If we don't want to play Ooze. Well.
I'm not thinking too much about which one I want to buff first.
I wouldn't think that it really matters too much.
Yeah. The other thing also about the Ooze is I think we're at the point of the game where the game is going to end in possibly 2 turns. I'm quite scared, but I'm also thinking, so I'm thinking I really should get this minion down on the board sooner rather than later. Also, when I look at my hand, double Azure Drake, I can still play for a late game. But obviously, if this were to go to a late game, the implication may be where he's getting swings in with Assassin's Blade anyway.
Right.
regardless, I don't think I could play around both Assassin's Blade and Sap. I just think that there's just nothing I can do about it.
Right.
At the very least, Counterspell could potentially stop and Eviscerate later as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so he kept Deadly Poison plus Blade Flurry.
Right, and then the Eviscerate
And he's getting the
phase.
Eviscerate right away,
Okay.
so I potentially just lose the game to Leroy right now.
Well.
And now I don't lose the game.
Alright,
So
yeah.
this was exactly what I was going to be considering, is I need to draw into Mirror Image, I'm spam able to freeze him, any minions he can play I can odds up ping. The only way he kills me is with raw damage, right? Like, not spells, I already have a counter spell, and he played one Eviscerate.
Right.
I need Mirror Image, so it was going to be just Azure Drake. Like, there's no way to draw more than one card. So, unless, let's say, I Loot Hoarder Ping into Prey, potentially then Arcane Intellect into Mirror Image, which, honestly, I might have been that desperate. That might have actually been a better play, because the threat of Leroy is just insanely high. Literally,
Right.
I don't need Azure Drake. If I just keep the Water Elemental, as long as I get the Mirror Image, I'm a completely fine spot. And if I
Right.
did survive, I can then Azure Drake potentially draw it later. So honestly, there could be a world where just pinging Loot Order, just for the chance of Arcane Intellect and into Mirror Image, it could have absolutely been a thing.
Now, would you consider here playing...
That was potential counterspell could have been better.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, is maybe like Loot Hoarder, Mirror Image, Counterspell, and ping on the end there. I mean, it's nice to have the Drake. It sets up 2-turn lethal here, right? Or, let's see, 7,
I would
8.
say, for one, it's perhaps a little greedy, but at the same time, the game lasting too long is a bit concerning still. Like, there is a chance he could potentially get 2 ways of removing each of these, and then play Leroy. Like, maybe if he
Right.
plays 2 charges this turn, and then follows up with Leroy, I could lose the game that way.
Right.
This is the kind of thing where I mean, I don't know what the odds are, and that's completely what depends on what the odds are. And I don't know what those are, and this is why turns like this, or those last 2 turns, are basically where you can make like the biggest difference. Like that's going to separate, like, you know, the tippity top of the players, is those kind of decisions where it's really hard to calculate. They will have better reads on what's better.
Right.
Same with like the Apprentice over I think, what was it, some other card very early on. Those very small decisions which can make a difference. So at this point, I'm thinking, can I play to close the game out? If I play Azure Drake, I can always counterspell, always just ping into this, can always trade this off later. I will start off by going for the draw. Actually, first off, I need to think, what do I have? I have no fireballs left, actually. I have 1 Frostbolt, but Mirror Entity doesn't do anything, so may as well just play my hand.
Right,
And
yeah.
the instant damage from this doesn't do anything.
We have no Arcane Missiles.
But I do have Frostbolt, though.
So I would think that the Counterspell... Well, I guess we can do something with the Loot Hoarder first. But I would think the Counterspell, now that we're at 4 health, is probably pretty important here to stop that
The main
Eviscerate.
concern is just Eviscerate.
Right.
The thinking was, do I trade Loot Hoarder, or when do I do it? I'm thinking the damage is not going to make a difference at this point of the game.
Right.
He's gonna be dead next turn. I don't need the damage from the Loot Hoarder, so don't worry about pinging his Loot Hoarder. Just trade in my. I mean, don't worry about pinging his Leponome. Just trade in my Loot Hoarder. Go for the draw. You know, and potentially get either a Frostbolt, which would have won the game, or get a another Mirror Image. And there, very close game actually.
Yeah, absolutely. Nice. Well played.
But yeah, this was a case where it seemed like any of the decisions that I was actually a little unsure of, they weren't big enough to make the difference. Also, it does seem like when I'm considering the difference between the Azure Drake versus Loot Hoarder, while I was so certain I was gonna die to Leroy, and even if not Leroy, it's like charge eventually. You know, point being, I need Mirror Image. Still, the other point being, I do need to try end the game sooner rather than later, because the more time he has, the more time he has to get through those taunts.
Right.
You asked for it.
All right, so a little bit different of a matchup here with Druid. You'd mentioned that we usually almost always want to keep a 2-drop. Would you ever consider keeping two 2-drops here, or are we thinking just loot Hoarder maybe?
Um, I'm thinking I obviously get rid of Fireball. The main thing is like neither. I don't think there's a 2-drop that's particularly that much stronger than the other. I'm not as scared as him playing a Innovate Keeper or anything, but the other another big thing to consider is if they don't have Wrath, if they don't have any ramp, then he's gonna ping Loot Hoarder. He's gonna be fine with that. Whereas if I Ooze, he's quite unhappy. Him having Innovate Keeper or Wildgrowth Keeper is quite sad. It's a lot more unlikely. And regardless, if he had it, even if I play Loot Hoarder, I'm still quite sad. And if he Wraths either way, it's not that big of a deal. I think overall, Ooze probably has a bigger chance.
Mm-hmm.
And mulliganing 2 cards already, if I'm to get value from that Loot Hoarder, it is going to be going into 10-3, which means how desperate am I to look for a 10-3 play like Kirin Tor?
Right.
I did mention it is quite good in this matchup, but I don't feel like I'm going to be desperate enough, but who knows.
Well, there's Mirror Entity. I mean, we've already seen an Innervate come out, so Mirror Entity might think, well, it's not going to get like an enormous innervated minion, but the Mirror Entity here will snag whatever comes next, which I don't know when it's coming, but it's probably going to be something big.
This is a little unfortunate, but it's still alright depending on what he does. I'm really, at this point, hoping he... Okay, now that's really sad. I was hoping that he was just going to be Hero Power into Hero Power, and I could Mirror Entity into Thalnos, finish this off with a ping. Unfortunately, that's not the case. I'm not playing as optimally as I care to be. The main thing if I'm trying harder, I would try get a better read of his hand, which I'm not focusing as much on like his hand. So the main concern that I'm having right now is why did he coin Innovate Wild Growth instead of doing something different? I think if you had double 4-drop, which all these cards these two he had by 10-1, this one 10-2, this one by 10-1. So if either of these are a 4-drop, this play makes complete sense. If you had a Harvest Golem, you probably would have coined the Wild Growth first. So I'm thinking that the odds of there being a 4-drop in there is really high. But we've already seen one Yeti, so I think Keeper is quite likely. So I think Mirror Entity, if he Keepers, I am in just the worst spot. So I think it's just going to be ping Mana Wyrm.
I was thinking the same thing. As Keeper will just lose us the game. If we play Mirror Entity, it just gets killed by the Yeti, and then the Yeti is 4-2, and we don't have enough to really kill it.
Actually, thinking about before, I should have thought about this sooner. Actually, if he did have Keeper, he would have played it instead of the Yeti. So odds are this card is very likely not Keeper then.
Right. And I guess it's not Senjin. Senjin probably would have been played here as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Basically, I'll try to keep better track of this now. So we know none of these cards are Senjin. None of them are Yeti. Maybe Keeper. Well, not this one because he would probably play it over the Yeti. But yeah, no Senjin, no Yeti.
Well, that leaves some rather larger minions then. We're talking Druid of the Claw, Ancient of Lore, things
so Mirror Entity could very well get pretty good value this next turn, like seeing like a Druid of the Claw or something. But I really don't want to just go for a 50-50 here. But okay, okay, I know what I want to do. I'll explain it afterwards.
Well, we can take the 50-50 first with Arcane Missiles, right? And then choose whether to ping or to play Mirror Entity there.
So that was the idea. The original thinking was, do I play Thalnos? But after I figure out, actually pay more attention, it's like, okay, well, if I play Thalnos, Mirror Entity's off the table. Right. If I Arcane Missiles, if it misses, I ping. But then if it doesn't miss, I get some Mirror Entity, and Mirror Entity here is massive, so... Right. That's where it becomes pretty obvious. Like a 50-50, I'll nearly win the game if I get this Mirror Entity off. So exactly. 50-50 is like, this is very big deal versus just Thalnos.
Right. Yeah. Totally. It would be a situation in which it's nice to just try a free roll there, right? Why not?
So in this case, he did draw two more cards, so there's more of a possibility he could play a 4-drop. But again, we still already saw the one. We know what this card still could possibly be one. They don't really run cards much cheaper than that, and considering it's a 10-6, he may just say, screw it, I'm just going to play on curve. Mirror Entity is looking decent to play here. I still think if I don't Azure Drake, when do I? Okay, so my main concern is, so one, I would like to draw, and the biggest thing I think I'm thinking about is I really want value, and if I can draw into a Kirin Tor Mage, that could be enough to get me back in this game.
Yeah.
The other thinking is if I play Mirror Entity, there is a chance he just doesn't play a minion. It could be something like a Wrath, and then how maybe he still plays a minion. Like if he did exactly what he did right here, he could play Sen'jin, he could trade his guy into the Sen'jin, and then Wrath my guy. The situation is actually, I think it's near the same. Let me see what would have been different.
I think it's a little bit better here because the Ancient Allure would have traded into Sen'jin.
This is one less health, and I result in having +1 card.
Right.
This is basically the scenario I would expect myself to see. And even if he just played a 6-drop, having Azure Drake alive is still quite scary for him.
Right.
So I'm not too scared of that. Now if I look at my hand, this obviously needs to die. Mirror Image versus Fireball. We did already see one Ancient of Lore. I think if there are any minions to come down, they may not be that spooky. Fireball. This is really, I think, like a big deciding turn. I will say I'm not that sure. I'm just gonna play Mirror Images now, so at the very least, depending on what he trades, this could avoid a good trade on his part. Other thing being is just the Mirror Images don't look like they're gonna get too much more value later.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I actually like this play a lot because we're going into turn 7. There's definitely the possibility that Ancient of War is the thing in hand, and I'm starting to get a pretty good read that it is. But also just
might be considering these plays.
Like Sen'jin isn't the #1 target for Fireball, right? We'd rather save it for like Ancient of Lore.
There's Ancient of Lore. There's not many better Fireball targets I'm thinking of. There's already been one Ancient of Lore, and I'm thinking
Druid of the Claw.
The attack doesn't matter as much as the health does, because I think regardless, like whatever I get from your entity can possibly just trade into the thing anyway,
right.
Or even with a ping. I'm not as concerned about there being better Fireball targets as much as I am thinking about how much value can I get out of the mirror entity.
Mm-hmm.
Because he's kept the cards, I'm thinking it's very likely spells, like probably Force of Nature, Savage Roar, but that also means if he gets a single minion, he's got to just play it, which means it could be a big one, which means he doesn't have small ones to bait out the mirror entity with. So it seems like playing the mirror entity there could have been a very good thing, because knowing that like he has to play around 1 already, like he may need to just play a 5-drop, or if he plays, let's say, Keeper, and then can't play a 5-drop with it, he then has to worry about then, oh, turns out now there's another mirror entity, and you still can't play a big minions.
Right.
This is fortunate that he at least didn't follow up with a Druid of the Claw, which I am a bit surprised by.
Because now we just get our second mirror entity, and now whatever was being held in hand before, it's going to be even more backbreaking now that the Harvest Column is gone. And that was a top deck,
I'm wondering if maybe he's just thinking that like there's not going to be many better things to swipe. My main concern is if he had either Azure Drake or if he had Druid of the Claw, would he have played either? I think if you have Azure Drake, you keep it, because Azure Drake plus swipe can be really good, because, you know, it's the deck that can run cards like Sorcerer Apprentice, you may be thinking Knife Juggler or even another Mirror Image. I think if you have Azure Drake saving with the swipe going to turn 9 is quite good. So I could see why he may hold that, but at the same time, he'd probably hold the swipe. I think if he had Druid of the Claw, I really think he would have played it. And considering he passed on turn 7, it's quite likely that the last card is Ancient of Lore or Rag. So I'm definitely thinking it's got to be the Mirror Entity this turn. I'm not worried about clearing this, so I'll just play on curve for now. I think this Mirror Entity can get a lot done here. He may just have to play into it.
Yeah, I have a feeling that it's... Oh, any tests for it? I have a feeling it's got to be something that's 7 or greater, right? Because on turn 7, you hero powered and pass.
Yeah, just passing.
Yeah.
At this point, I really expected my read to be Savage Roar or Force of Nature, like just very dead cards. It's definitely not a test. I think this is just like what you would normally do. I wouldn't be surprised if you had 2 of these, if not, Force of Nature. So this is very expected.
Right, and Counterspell's
still
pretty
no
strong
play
here too. Now that we've seen one Savage Roar, maybe we'll see another.
What I'm expecting from the Counterspell is there's no spells it can like get rid of that will do anything for me now. It's like, honestly, it's going to be bad. Even if he plays just like a single Force of Nature, just the fact that he's getting the Counterspell out of the way will be more beneficial to him.
Right.
The main way I think I use this Counterspell, given my lack of resources, would be playing it with something like Water Elemental, so then when it's on board, he wants to clear it, but then he may not have the mana to both test for it and clear it at the same time. So I think I do want to hold off on the Counterspell.
Interesting. Yeah, I like that patient approach here of waiting until you have something to protect with the Counterspell.
This scenario is... It feels bad, but the Arcane Missiles, like, I have to play for it value. I can't just waste it for damage. And obviously, losing the spell damage when I have 2 spells that do damage in hand definitely sucks, but I'm too desperate to get this card draw. I feel like the difference of if I draw like a Water Elemental or Rag could be massive, and it's only 1 spell damage. There's a chance it doesn't make too big a difference.
Right.
So yeah, and it looks like it's really, really working out. Okay, this is perfect. Being that it drawn it specifically, these 2 cards is absolutely perfect.
Yeah.
I think these might have actually just been like the perfect draws. Actually, I can dump now my entire hand, deal with this, pressure the board, get the Counterspell. Now he can't even contest my board. I am in a near perfect position because of this.
Right. Yeah. The Kirin Tor was super clutch there, and also just the one, Water Elemental is just out of reach of everything on the board right now. And after the Frostbolt, we can YOLO with the missiles, I assume, as well. Go for...
It's just not getting better later is the biggest reason. And another thing is he could potentially keep it or silence it, but which is also massive, actually. And also because he can't really play spells, so it's like, it may need to be like Keeper plus Druid of the Claw. So that would be one of the biggest ways he turns this game around. So for one, it plays around that. But the other thing is just very simply, Arcane Missiles is not getting better later. For one, I'm at the point of the game where I do need to just push to kill. And for 2, I do want to get rid of that minion anyway. And, well, yeah, it's just not going to get better later. It's like...
Right. Yeah, it's the same with Avenging Wrath and Paladin. Is you kind of just got to let go of it. If you don't have equality with it, you kind of just have to let go of it when they have the fewest creatures on the board. Otherwise, it's like 3 Druid creatures eating up Avenging Wrath.
There's like a 10-to-1 ratio of like reasons to use it now versus later.
Right.
Okay, so this position, like this card was still early on. These 2 not so much. So the left card, I'm still thinking it could be Savage Roar, Force of Nature. There is a bit of a question to whether to trade or not. Both Savage Roar and Force of Nature I feel like is maybe a bit too much. Maybe I can't play around all that anyway. If I clear both, ends up with 3 health, 4 health. Force of Nature will allow him to clear if he hero powers 2, but then I have a Will Element he might be able to finish. I guess Force of Nature, it doesn't make sense to trade then. It has to be specifically second Savage Roar, which you already saw 1 of. If he does have it, even that alone, yeah, it's still not good enough. It needs to be specifically Savage Roar, Force of Nature, which even if I trade, it's still bad for me. So
yeah, I would think. Yeah, you're right. Is that trading just doesn't work out to Force of Nature, right? So if there's
almost no way to. there's almost no way I'd actually regret hitting face here. Basically, I've again nearly like 10 reasons to go face versus like one reason not to.
Right, right. And we have 12 cards left in deck. One of those is Rag, which is a chance at lethal. We have Fireball, which is instant lethal. And we have 2 Arcane Intellects left as well as a Loot Hoarder that we can ping off. So we have a few chances here to win still, just outright.
Okay, so there's the Savage Roar.
Okay, so it was a Roar. And Roar, not, part of what we didn't talk about here was hitting face with that Water Elemental instead of trading. Now he can't use that 3 damage there, right? Yeah.
Yep, it's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, trading 2 Keepers into a single 5/5 isn't exactly ideal. And there we go.
Yeah, I have a lot of cases just go for lethal, and even if I didn't, it's like, double intellect. The cards that I could draw, Apprentice would mean he could potentially come back if he drew Force of Nature for a full clear. He would then, I think he used both laws so he can't heal, so he would need me to also not draw into Rag, or if I do, he needs to then have a minion, a Rag hits, and then also then still deal with Rag with like a BGH. He was just in a very, very bad position by that point.
Right, exactly. The turn where you swing it there with the Ancient of Lore on the board, plus the Kirin Tor, plus the Water Elemental, you're talking 14 points of HP for a Druid to deal with, and I believe he had Counterspell up still at that point, or you just played Counterspell?
I think he dealt with it previously.
He played it, I think he played it on
that
turn, yeah, when he played
when he double keep it, he wild grift.
Yeah, so it's like, 16 HP worth of minions. How do you deal with that as a Druid, especially when those minions are beefy enough that they're not going to just die to like Druid of the Claw or something? So yeah, that was an awesome game. Both of those actually good games, and very patient again with the resources, especially the deployment of that Counterspell was really nice. We are running out of time here, so I think that we're going to wrap it up. But Arcues, I want to thank you for coming on the show. A really very educational session here today. And I think one of my hopes is that even as somebody who has not even as level 60 mage yet, after playing for 8 years, even I'm inspired a little bit to play this deck. I hope that others who have been making attempts at tempo mage can maybe give it a fresh look, or maybe learn something, kind of understand how to play the deck a little bit better, see some of those common mistakes that you were pointing out earlier.
Yep.
If folks ever want to get in touch with you, ask you more questions, what's a good way for them to do that?
I would say probably you can message me on Discord. I would always respond, being Arcues #7813. I also stream on Twitch at Sonadurge, SONADOURGE. I don't always stream Hearthstone though. I mainly play WoW or Hearthstone, so I generally just stream whatever I want. But point is, if it's a point of just simply asking stuff, then always can just hop on by. I'm happy to answer people's questions.
Awesome. And I threw that link to your Twitch in the chat. We'll put that in the video description as well for folks to find. So, any last minute shout outs that you'd like to have? Any last minute advice that you'd like to give players before we finish up here?
Not really, I guess. Only main final thoughts, I guess, was like, part of the reason I also liked the deck more was because other people didn't play it. It's like, if something is a meta deck, it feels like, well, you're just playing another meta deck. It feels a little more special when you're playing something that people don't really play. And looking at the list as it is and how it's played, it's like, I mean, it really feels like, why wouldn't this be a meta deck? Like, seems pretty good.
Yeah, we see like a Miracle Rogue or some of these other decks where it just feels like maybe there's a lot of complexity there, and I wonder why that that level of complexity that exists in other decks hasn't necessarily been explored as much. It's like, yeah, we all know that Miracle Rogue is like a deck that requires some hard decisions to make. This is just like that, right? And has similar payoffs. It just doesn't. We don't have the joy of drawing like 15 cards with Gadget Sand in one turn. But
I mean, the main thing I think of is just Miracle Rogue is just simply the best deck. It's just the main thing that I'm thinking is when it comes to Classic, when there's like a format that doesn't really get expanded, I usually expect people to just fully explore the format, and that's one thing that made me really surprised about why. But by the way, you should spectate this game. It's almost over. But yeah, that's something of why I was very surprised that this deck wasn't really explored, at least like this list yet.
Let's take a look at what
But
we
yeah,
got going down here.
this is the exact scenario I was talking about. The mirror entity completely carrying the game for me.
Oh yeah,
Winning the game on 10-5 versus Handlock.
snagging that MG. Yeah, it seems like this is maybe the hardest handlock counter of any deck that we have in Classic, just because it has the right amount of burn to get around those taunts, and it also has this absolutely damning turn 3, where we
They
either
just
get
need to run
Counterspell.
Doomsayer.
Yeah, exactly. Just run Doomsayer. I'll definitely make sure that's in mind instead of the second Siphon Soul when I'm playing Handlock, at least if I see you logged in. All right, well, thanks again for coming on. Really appreciate it. To all the viewers that tuned in, thanks for coming by. You can always subscribe to the channel. We'll have these every single week so we can find more unique and interesting decks. We don't usually stick to just the meta decks. We're looking for those interesting decks that are played by high-level players with success. So, once again, Arcues, thanks a lot for joining us, and thanks everybody for tuning in. We'll see you next week.